There's a lot, guys. So we're going to kick it off in a few minutes, everyone. Just waiting for the doctors to join. I did do a tweet about 10, 15 minutes ago, and in which I asked for recommendations. We do need doctors that are, because this is not going to be only about Damar. It's going to extend to a wider topic about vaccines and the risks involved. And I think the timing is right because this discussion is just gaining a lot of attention. And we do need doctors covering both sides of the argument. We are organizing this last minute. Our organizer, Romy, who usually manages the show, is really sick. So we had other team members take care. So if you want to help us out, do recommend doctors that have concerns with the vaccines. Put that in the comments or just DM us their username and we can invite them.
You mean Mario? Yeah, because I'm not reading DMs.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, my team checks my DMs. So when I say us, it's my team, and that's in the DMs. And if anyone's requesting to speak, as always, better to DM when requesting to speak, because a lot of the times, most of the time, especially when we hit big numbers, we can't see the requests anymore. So just a heads up, make sure you DM as usual. Same process. All right, we'll give it another couple of minutes. I'll just mute myself. Because a lot of the times, most of the time. Okay, I'm just going to mute my mic. Just give it another couple of minutes before we kick it off to get the panel ready.
Yeah, it'll be good to have both sides of the aisle. You know, people who are pro-vaccine, people who are vaccine skeptics. You know, I mean, we're not gonna get anyone who's like crazy up on here. You know, no lizard people invented vaccines.
Yeah, please let's not.
Yeah, I don't want to give a platform to people like that, but I do think that you know, there are genuine concerns about about the vaccines that need to be answered, and you know, I hope that the doctors can have a wonderful discussion about it.
Yeah, this is going to be a fun one, especially if my car gets towed from the hospital here because I'm kind of parked on the sidewalk. But
Nick, you're giving away the plot.
Don't you get a special pass or anything?
No, I just start telling people I'm a journalist, and they'd be like, they're like, "Oh, that's okay." But
Nick's special passes is charisma and chutzpah.
Thanks, Catherine. I appreciate it.
When they ask me, like, I'm a journalist, don't question it.
I mean, that's how most journalists do it.
It's a small trick before we kick off the space. Nick, it's a small trick I've used multiple times. I just go in really anywhere and I just say, hey, I just walk in confidently. Doesn't matter where it is. When you walk in confidently, like you belong there, whether it's the backstage of a concert, a special meeting, you know, I've done it so many times. If that confidence, no one will question it, and they'll just let you through without even asking. It doesn't always work, man. If you get arrested, don't blame me. But it's a little tactic that I've used.
And that's how I got into the CIA headquarters.
Oh yeah. Well, no, I mean, I typically, you know, if I'm going to do something like that, I'm going to wear a high visibility jacket. Because then you're definitely not being questioned. Because, you know, nobody wants to question why. You can walk right into the freaking Disney World if you want to, because they're just going to assume you should be there. So.
All right, guys. So I'm gonna kick it off in about a minute. Let me just confirm the panel.
So I invited my two doctors, but it might be a few minutes before they join.
Yeah, no problem. There's a lot to talk about before kicking it off. So just for the audience, give you an overview. The goal of this discussion, like we thought long and hard on whether to do a space on this. So Nick woke me up, like I was exhausted. I was like 2 hours, and he wakes me up. And he's like, Mario, this is happening. So we kind of debated. I was like half asleep. I tweeted asking for feedback on whether we should cover the story. And then we concluded that there wasn't like doing an urgent space. So when we do a space, impromptu space, like when Andrew Tate got arrested, the only reason we do it is to cover things developing live. But in this case, Damar was already at the hospital and there wasn't any updates. So everyone knew the story. So we didn't find much value in doing it hours and hours ago. But the reason we're doing it now is not only to cover, you know, the latest with Damar. And Nick is at the hospital right now. He's been there for, I don't know how many hours. He'll give you an overview. So massive respect to Nick. But not only this, but to discuss the wider topic, because I know there's a lot of people concerned with the vaccines and the long-term effect of the vaccine. And that's a discussion we've had in a previous panel, which went really well. Let me ping Dr. Drew if he can jump into this one as well. But I think it's worth having again, considering the amount of attention it's getting. And there's just a lot of legitimate questions worth discussing. As always, we'll be as balanced as we can, as objective as possible, and we check the comments in the bottom right corner. So any feedback, any questions, my team is checking the comments, bottom right corner. Do put it there, and we'll bring it up, or we'll respond to you as well. Otherwise, yeah, Nick, I'll let you kick it off. What's the latest, man? Like, you've been there for a long time. Would love you to give us an overview. Make sure your audio is good, because I know you're outdoors. Just give us an overview, man, because you're the main guy that deserves all the credit with the space. So much respect.
So appreciate it, Mario. So I am the self-designated Roundtable Club NFL correspondent now, and I am on the ground here in Cincinnati, Ohio, at UC Medical. I've been here since about 2 o'clock in the morning. There's a lot that's been going on since then. A lot of you guys have heard this story. A lot of you guys have seen the video. It was terrible. It's awful to watch. Facebook and YouTube in particular started scrubbing the video last night because there was a lot of fear that Mr. Hamlin had actually passed away there on the field. We now know that is not the case. He did not pass away on the field. What had happened?
Is it me? Did Nick drop out?
No, we lost.
Oh, okay, good. I thought it was me, because if it drops out for me, then it would drop out for the space could crash.
Everyone.
So while waiting for Nick to join, so while waiting for Nick's audio to come back, Ian or Catherine, because I know you've been, especially you, Catherine, I think you've been talking to Nick for hours as well. Do you want to continue the overview before Nick connects again?
Sure. So Nick basically, so I think that Nick has a lot of great context, but Nick has actually was crazy or bold enough to get out down there to the hospital, and drove out there, and he was watching the scene unfold, because there's a lot of police presence, and also a lot of people at the hospital sort of keeping an eye as the player was brought to the hospital. Mario, did you want to say something?
Yeah, no, that's pretty much it. Like, we're seeing a lot of so a lot of people jumped to conclusions in the early stages, and I'm even facing a bit of backlash now doing a space about the matter, just because we don't have all the facts. It's just really, really early, and that's why it's important to understand that there will be a press conference shortly, maybe during this space, but it's important to understand that we can only speculate on the matter in case. I think it's a worthwhile discussion, and then the goal is to expand it to a wider topic. But Ian did go there early, so he's going to be connecting again. He just DM'd me. I think his phone died again, but he drove to the hospital, and I've got a thread that's pinned on my profile, and he's responsible for most of the content there. So we've been on regular calls, and he's been speaking to journalists. There's a lot of fans there as well, and he'll be able to give us an insight into exactly what happened and what's the latest there, and he'll be covering the press conference as well. Now, the discussion that I want to kick it off with, and maybe Lisa, Molly are already on the stage, and we've got other doctors that will be joining, is what exactly caused this. Now, there's two main theories that are being brought up, and I'm going to read them out from some great threads, and I'm going to read out those threads. If you can send an invite, Ian, to Nick, that would be great to come on.
Yeah,
I'm going to read out those threads, and we've got Eugene, we've got Anish, Molly, and Lisa here to discuss, and of course Joanna as well. Got a great panel to discuss those theories in relation to Damar, but also just as a wider topic. So I'm going to read out the first thread by Dr. Khalid Al-Jabri. My prayers are with Damar. As an arrhythmia specialist, and we've invited Khalid as well, he should hopefully be able to join. I believe the blow to his chest during a certain period in the cardiac cycle triggered ventricular fibrillation, a condition called commotio cordis. It is not associated with pre-existing heart damage or COVID vaccines or COVID itself. Damar Hamlin stood up for a few seconds, then lost his consciousness. Is commotio cordis still the likely diagnosis? The answer is yes, even though it's very rare, by the way, for everyone. It's a very rare condition or event occurrence.
And only the mean age that occurs in people is 15 years old, but that is debatable as to whether it's because kids just play more sports than adults do, or what, right? Or if the adults have like a stronger muscles in the heart area that prevents that from happening usually, but it's not you know, I mean, it is uncommon, but it's not unheard of, right? It's not impossible. Sorry, you were speaking?
Oh shit, I'm talking with my mute. So I'll continue reading. Loss of consciousness starts at about, if you can mute Nick, and I'll give you the mic in a bit. Loss of consciousness starts at about 8 seconds after the last heartbeat, and circulatory standstill occurs after 10 to 15 seconds. So that's the first theory. I've got here another doctor. Let me have a look now. Okay, again, another doctor saying that it's commotio cordis, Dr. John E. Canuck. Now we've got another one here. On Damar Hamlin and Dr. Stutter's diagnosis of commotio cordis, I am shocked that CC, commotio cordis, is named as the cause. Please examine the images carefully. In CC, ventricular fibrillation can be triggered by chest wall impact only over the heart and predominantly occurs with impact over the center of the left ventricle. Although CC usually involves impact from a baseball, it has also been reported during hockey, softball, lacrosse, karate, and other sports activities in which a relatively hard and compact projectile or bodily contact caused impact to the person's precordium. Are we to believe that with the padding that professional football players wear, the location of the heart and the location of the impact, that this was actually CC? Nonsense. Rapidly stated narrative nonsense, etc. And we've got Dr. McCullough, Peter A. McCullough, sent us his thoughts on this, that we should consider that it's, let me read the statement itself. Let me open it up and then we'll give it out to the doctors. So we should consider that it could be myocarditis caused by the vaccine. And this is a whole different discussion. Myocarditis, how much is it caused by COVID versus vaccines? How big of an issue is it? So that will be the main discussion of the day. But before going to our doctors, to our panel, Nick, you were speaking earlier. I'll let you summarize your whole experience at the hospital before we kick off the discussion. And again, for the audience, any questions, bottom right corner, and we'll be watching the comments. Go ahead, Nick.
Yeah, so I'm sorry about that. There's a lot of there's a hell of a lot of news agencies here that are, you know, they're live and stuff. They're using the network here, so sometimes it's a little bit slow. But yeah, so I don't know how far I got into that. Can you kind of refresh me a little bit?
Yeah, just kick it off again, man. Like you cut it out really, really early.
Oh, okay, good. All right, so I got here about 2 o'clock in the morning last night at the University of Cincinnati Medical Center. There were several news agencies that were posted up here, so I was able to start getting into conversations with them. Obviously, what had happened last night, as a lot of you saw, Mr. Hamlin did go down on the field, and Mario, I'm sure, has explained this a little bit, where he had they had to perform CPR on him for a total of 9 seconds, but they were able to eventually get his heart restarted. That was not initially reported, so we're really glad to hear that. If they did not have medical staff on the sidelines, this would have been a totally different outcome. What we've got right now is Mr. Hamlin is in the hospital here at UC. He is sedated, he is intubated, and obviously he is unresponsive. So we're hoping for the best here. We have not gotten any updates. We do know that he coded last night, which basically means that, and the doctors can explain this a little bit more. They ended up calling off the press conference for this reason. So that wasn't a particularly good sign. We didn't really like to hear that. But as of now, there's been a lot of conversation going around about how this happened, why this happened, and does it have anything to do with a vaccine? As you guys have probably seen on Twitter for the past 12 hours, it's been one of the top trending topics. So
hey, Nishko, guys, a cardiologist here. That's that's the first I'm hearing. So Nick, they told you, or someone told you, that he had another cardiac arrest while he was in the hospital?
Yes, he did. That's why they canceled the press conference last night.
Again, getting back to why this may have happened, all right, in the first place, look, obviously there's a collision. After a collision, there's clearly an arrhythmic arrest that happens. Yes, of course, commotio cordis is one of the list of possibilities, but it's very important not to prematurely anchor to that, because you want to think about, lethal activity-related cardiac arrest happens in athletes and has been happening in athletes before COVID too. And the issue is that there's this catecholamine surge, which then plays upon, which interacts with certain proclivities that an individual may have to have these lethal arrhythmias. All right, some of those things are hypertrophic obstructive cardiomyopathy, where the heart muscle congenitally is abnormally thick or large, and that may predispose you to have a lethal arrhythmia while playing sports. Other things are their electrical channel issues. Basically, you're born with electrical wiring that predisposes you to have these events as well. So when when these events happen to these incredibly tragic, unfortunate events happen to athletes while they're on the athletic field, there's a list of things that you need to think about, and something that's predisposing is an important piece of that. And that's the first thing that I thought of, is that there's a list. Commotio cordis is one of those things, obviously, because there was a collision here. The interesting thing is that when it comes to commotio cordis, again, no one's an expert on commotio cordis because it happens so rarely. Okay, the Minneapolis Registry, which is one of the largest registries of commotio cordis, has 215 folks that had commotio, and that is over 15 years. All right, so just to go to show you how rare something like this is, the vast majority of those reports are related to a what Mario was quoting, a hard ball, a puck, or something like that, directly impacting on unpadded chest. But it's not impossible, and it's been reported again within commotio cordis, which is very rare. It is rare within that to have it be a football player related collision, but it does happen. So it is on the plausible list. But I'll just say, and this is new information that I'm hearing from Nick for the first time, the fact that if he had another arrest, right, and if it is the same thing, another arrhythmic arrest overnight, now there's no one impacting him. I mean, there's no one impacting his chest. Then that suggests that, look, commotio cordis moves down a little bit. It could be that he has one of these other proclivities, what I talked about, something structural or something electrical that's going on that kind of predisposed him to having this. So the fact that he arrested again, if that's true and confirmed overnight, that's very interesting. I'll be interested to hear from any other panel whether or not they think that it's not. Then that makes it much more murky, and it makes it likely that anchoring the commotio cordis was probably the right thing.
Dr. Danish, I'll let you go.
Yeah, all I was going to say was the one thing about the underlying structural abnormality that we have to take into account is that since he's a professional player and he was in the combine 12 months ago, high likelihood that they did a stress echo. I think every one of them gets a stress echo. And so they would have seen something very structural, specifically HCM or hypertrophic obstructive cardiomyopathy, likely in the combine eval, I would imagine, Anish, right?
But Dr. Danish, actually, I'm not sure about that. I mean, the few NFL players that have come through, I mean, a lot of times they have it's a physical exam by a non-cardiologist plus a EKG, and I don't know that they all. I mean, I'm not aware, and I've seen a fair number of professional. I mean, I have not seen a fair number. The professional athletes I've seen, they all haven't had a stress echo at some point in their life. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong. Maybe
can you explain? So, Dr. Danish, can you explain what you mean by a stress echo and why you're mentioning it? So, you're saying if it was myocarditis, I would have spotted it early on?
No, myocarditis. Just want to be very clear. Thank you for Mario. If you're thinking it, other people are thinking it too. So, thank you for saying that. It's not myocarditis in terms of what I was discussing. What Anish and I are talking about are specifically related to structural abnormalities that could be picked up on ultrasound imaging, which is called an echo, especially things like a stress echo, where they're putting stress on your body, and based on exercise, you can determine whether somebody has a structural abnormality, specifically one that we see in young men who are athletes, usually people of color. And it's something that we really do try to screen for. Anish, my understanding, I spoke with somebody who actually does this for a living to figure out whether that was the case. And he assured me that was common practice, especially in certain athletes, but I'll look into it more and I'll have the answer by the end of this conversation.
So Dr. Danish, and actually this goes to all the doctors on the panel. One of the biggest concerns that people had last night is when there were a lot of assumptions based on the way that he collapsed on the field, that he did indeed pass away on the field, right? So we know that's not true. We're very happy to hear that. But that kind of sparked a conversation. When was the last time that the NFL decided they were going to totally cancel a game over an instance like this? And then people started looking into, okay, when is the last time that a player died on the field? That's sort of what sparked the entire conversation about, is this the vaccine? Does this have anything to do with him being vaccinated? And I think that's going to continue on for a while. And God forbid he does pass, this is going to be a huge problem going forward.
I want to correct one thing, Nick, at least from my understanding, and I'll let other physicians speak, other people speak as well. The NFL did not cancel the game, from my understanding. The players did.
They all mutually agreed on that.
My understanding is the players said they are not going to play. So I want to be very, very clear. It's just, we have to speak broadly about a lot of these things. I actually loved what Anish mentioned about seeing a lot of my colleagues jump straight to commercial chorditis is kind of nuts. I'm not going to lie. I think people are just trying to react very quickly. And I think that ultimately we don't know what has occurred, and it's okay. I know it's really hard, but we teach our residents to do this. It's really okay to say we don't know yet exactly what happened.
But I will say, I just want to make clear, ESPN told me directly that the NFL, there was no pushback from on their side after the coaching staff requested that the game be canceled. So it was pretty much a mutual decision there.
What I've heard is that basically the NFL didn't automatically cancel the game. It was going to go on, but then the teams have discussed it amongst themselves and said like they would cancel it, and the NFL went with that. So that's what the impression that I have with the story.
Perfect. Thanks, guys. I want to go to Molly. Molly, good to have you.
Oh, thanks for having me. Yes. I just want to provide the big picture. Why are we having this conversation and what we know? We know that these young men were mandated to have a vaccine. They were not allowed informed consent, which is standard in medical ethics. And we know that there have been people injured by this vaccine. We know of people who have actually died, and the myocarditis was confirmed as the cause of that death. So in my mind, it's appropriate that people have these questions. And I wonder how we're going to go forward with this. I have a young son, 17 years old. He plays football. And he came in my room this morning and told me what happened. And he's very concerned because now, of course, in his mind, is this something that could happen to me if I get tackled that way?
And your son Molly, your son has the vaccine or has had COVID?
Oh, no. He's not vaccinated. No.
Okay.
And both of my kids get irritated with me for talking to them about it and saying, this is why I didn't vaccinate you, because we know that because you're a young male, you're in that category of likely to be injured by it, and you already had COVID, so you don't need it. And so I think it's really important for us to figure out, how are we going to answer these questions? We need to know. I'm so sad for this family, and I hate that this conversation needs to happen, but all of us know that this is not the first case. We all know of Ernest Ramirez, whose son died. We know it was caused from the vaccine. It was 5 days after his Pfizer vaccine. The myocarditis was confirmed. So, I just urge everyone to quit bickering, quit trying to assume that we know. We don't know, but we need to know.
So, Dr. Rutherford, I want to go into your background a little bit. You were previously a physician with the NIAID, correct?
I was no, I wasn't a physician when I worked with Dr. Fauci. I was I had just graduated from college. I was a biologist, and then I was a policy analyst with him. So I do have a background in biology. I studied immunology. I studied vaccines. I actually wrote a pamphlet on vaccines when I worked at NIAID. So that was before I went to med school. Tony wrote my med school recommendation.
Oh, you've got to be kidding me. So you've participated in a number of lawsuits on this topic, and you've testified as an expert witness on it, and You've done a fantastic job on it. So, I mean, your credentials are unbeatable here. But I do think it would be important to go to somebody like Eugene, because I'd love to have that the counter opinion there.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks. I just want to say a few words about why many physicians like myself have been talking about commotio cordis as a cause of this. And, first of all, our hearts.
And Eugene, maybe before you tell us, I'll let you continue with your condolences, but also not condolences, but like your thoughts on with the family. But can you tell us exactly what commotio cordis (CC) is exactly? Define it for the audience and myself.
Yeah, sure thing. It's a little bit of a rare medical term, but I'm going to try to explain it in as layperson terms as possible. So there are 4 chambers of the heart. There's the atria, right atrium, left atrium on the top, and then there are the ventricles. The heart has electrical activity, which you can look at on an EKG. I'm going to try to make this as simple.
Keep it as simple as you can. Yeah, very, very simple, just for the average Joe.
So basically, in between the heartbeats, there's something called a T wave. That's called the basically the time that the heart relaxes and has to repolarize. During this time, when the heart is like forced to relax, you can't have any other kind of electrical activity occurring. And if you do, such as if you have a blunt force trauma to the sternum right above the heart, there are some receptors, mechanoreceptors or ion channels that get activated, and it can actually generate an abnormal electrical activity. If that happens right before the peak of the T wave, or basically when the heart is relaxing, you could actually go into what we call ventricular fibrillation. That's where the heart, it's moving and it's quivering, but it's not actually pumping blood. And when it doesn't actually pump blood, you basically have a cardiac arrest of sorts, because you can't get blood flow to your brain, to your lungs, your vital organs, and you can collapse. And so that's kind of what commotio cordis.
Okay, so essentially during that moment, so just to kind of simplify it even further, during that moment of it's a slight, whatever, how long it lasts, the T wave moment, if there is blunt force, it could cause cardiac arrest. Is that a very simple way of explaining it, or did I miss the point?
Yeah, I guess the simplest way to explain it is when the heart is relaxing during this T wave moment.
And how long does that moment? How long does that moment last for?
It's like a few milliseconds. It's not very long, but during that time, if there's an external electrical activity occurring in the heart,
understood.
Yeah,
I think it's a good explanation. I appreciate it. So I'd love you to respond to the point that Molly made.
Yeah, definitely. So I think the reason why a lot of physicians like myself point to commotio cordis as a possible cause, like we don't really know what the actual cause is, right? Until they do a final determination at the University of Cincinnati, we don't know. So I want to echo that as well. But the reason why we want to show that there are other causes for this is because there's just a huge undercurrent on social media that the vaccines cause this, that myocarditis or some kind of side effect of the vaccine caused this, which I definitely do not believe. But because there's so much, I guess, interest and popularity about that cause among certain people, it was just a false narrative, in my opinion. And that's why we need to counter that false narrative with plausible explanations that we have seen, in medicine in the past with baseball players, lacrosse players, and yes, even football players who have had blunt force trauma to the chest that cause commotio cordis.
But so I'm sorry, I just want to respond to that last part as a clinician, right? As a doc, I have to say, you can't, in my opinion, it is just as incorrect to speak this early about something, because now the entire world is talking about commotio cordis. And if it's just to be a counter example of what could have occurred without tons and tons of disclaimers around, hey, we have no idea. It could have been a blunt force trauma. So, one thing that was being mentioned earlier is it could be a bradycardic episode. It could be a vagal episode. I want to be very, very clear.
I've just muted Dr. Danish because this mic is playing up. Who was jumping in? Was that you, Lisa, or was it Molly?
Yeah,
it was Dr. Dunn. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, Dr. Dunn, jump in.
Yeah. So please, so I'd like to just point out that as background, I was one of the team doctors for the St. Louis Blues. And in 2014, the NHL mandated that after Rich Peverly had a cardiac arrest on the bench and was resuscitated because there was an ER physician behind the glass and so they quickly were able to do CPR and defibrillate him. Right. But after that point, the NHL mandated that an emergency physician be at every game because cardiac arrest is, although very, very rare and having multiple causes, it is common enough in athletes to mandate that the NHL made that mandate. Jay Boomeister, who was one of the defense players for the Blues, also had a cardiac arrest right after coming off the ice in 2019 during the Stanley Cup playoffs. And once again, there are multiple causes for these different kinds of sudden cardiac issues or arrhythmias. Some of them are structural. Some of them are because of the way the wiring of the heart works. And so it is too early to say without knowing the more deep clinical details. It certainly looks mechanistically like that it could be commotio cordis, but there are multiple other causes that could lead to a similar.
I have Dr. Dan, I have a question for you before going to Joanna, and I know John, you want to speak as well. But before doing so, and Dr. Anish as well. But Lisa, my question to you is, you know, I was surprised to see the amount of traction, the theory that this was caused by a vaccine. Even though I know that some people mention CC, but there was 10 times more people mentioning myocarditis. I can never.
I can explain that.
Myocarditis.
I can kind of explain that.
Yeah, Ian. Yeah, maybe you could do that.
Yeah, give some insight into that.
Is this people are just? I feel like that people are just waiting for something to happen to jump on that wagon.
Okay, so there's.
And I'm not sorry. Just Ian, before you go, I'm not saying it isn't. We don't know. I'm just curious as to why that happened.
But there's a psychological syndrome.
Hey, Ian, can I just jump in real quickly?
Well, let me go first. Yeah, I just want to say that there's a thing called the Ford effect, right? Yeah. So when you buy a Ford truck, for instance, you can't help but notice all the other Ford trucks on the road. That's a thing that people do. You buy a Tesla, you'll start noticing other Teslas. You buy a Chevy, you'll start noticing other Chevys. And confirmation bias, right? And so when myocarditis, which is a known side effect for especially young people, it's extremely rare, but it does happen when you take the vaccine. Some people react negatively to it. This is proven. People start noticing things. So when they see that an athlete has collapsed in the field, they start noticing that, and that becomes like an issue. But I actually did the statistics, right? I actually ran the numbers, and the numbers are not significantly higher last year than they were in, say, 2019 or 2018. It fluctuates up and down. So as Dr. Lisa said, it is a common thing. I mean, it's rare, but it's still a relatively common thing for athletes to suffer cardiac arrest while playing sports. So anyway.
And before, so John, I know you want to jump in, so I'll let John, and then Joanna, you've been waiting very patiently. But I do want to make one point clear, just for everyone. We are not saying it's not myocarditis. But I'm asking that question purely out of curiosity. We also have Nelson on stage as well, so I'm going to give him the mic in a bit as well. He did a great space yesterday covering the story. I missed it, but would love his thoughts in a bit. But John, I'll let you go, then I'll let Joanna go right after.
Excellent. So I don't know if anybody ever remembers when you see the doctor punching the patient's chest. It used to be called a precordial thump. They used to actually thump you and then start CPR. So that's in part what we're looking at, the direct delivery of energy. And just to put that into perspective, that thump is about 5 units of energy, 5 joules. And the defibrillator delivers anywhere from 200 to 400 joules. So, impact to cause ventricular fibrillation is very, very rare. Now we have to time the impact to what's called an R on T phenomenon. In other words, that impact has to be delivered in a vulnerable part of the cardiac cycle to provoke that arrhythmia. Again, very, very unlikely and difficult. Finally, another point here is that the threshold to fibrillation, in other words, the predisposition of the heart to go into ventricular fibrillation, may be compromised in the presence of myocarditis. So again, it's this complex array of factors here that are going on. So it's real interesting. And Ian, I'm going to shut up, but thank you for the dialogue. It's so speculative now that it's almost inappropriate to make some of these claims. But thanks for the opportunity to chime in.
No, I appreciate it, John, and I think it's very well explained. Joanna, thank you for waiting.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you for having me. So just a little bit about my background for your audience. I'm an anesthesiologist and also an intensivist. I work in the surgical ICU and also the cardiovascular ICU out here in New York City, but I'm actually from Buffalo, New York myself, and a proud Bills fan. But I just wanted to kind of take a step back and just let your audience know that when a patient initially presents to an emergency room, to a physician with a complaint, with an active issue, what we do first is actually form a differential diagnosis. And this is a term that probably everybody has heard of at one point. And as we're talking about some of these things, I just want the audience to be aware, at the top of what we believe may be going on, I think the consensus here is commotio cordis, which has been explained. But there are other potential etiologies to explain what may have happened. For instance, cardiac tamponade, which is when the sac around the heart fills with blood or fluid, a cardiac contusion. I didn't see the initial injury, but even a cerebral hemorrhage can lead to arrhythmias. And now that we know that there was a second arrest event when he was at the hospital, it sounds like, sometimes what we think and how we stratify our diagnoses changes. And obviously we're working with limited information. But I did want to take an opportunity to just speak to the notion that the vaccine may have contributed in some way. And I hesitate to ascribe what happened to that. I think that the vaccine has become so politicized, and this is an opportunity for that to be potentiated. And in reviewing the footage, in looking at what's in front of us, we ultimately will defer to what the findings are, of course, from the University of Cincinnati Medical Center. But I just wanted to kind of put all of this back into perspective for the audience.
And before going to Katie and Anish, Grant and Nelson, you guys did a great space yesterday covering the whole story live since it's, as soon as it broke. I'd love your take on it, guys. And what would you say was the conclusion from yesterday's space, and what insight can you share with the audience? And congratulations on a great space, guys.
Mario, appreciate you, brother. Thank you very much. Grant, you want to go first, or do you want me to jump in first?
No, go ahead.
I mean, brother, like this is my stance on this, right? Nothing that happened yesterday is normal. I think somebody has a hot mic. Nothing that happened yesterday is normal, right? From a 24-year-old man, a 24-year-old athlete, by the way, right? In the NFL, dropping like that during an NFL game, to the NFL canceling that game, to U.S. government planes being seen outside that hospital, to the press conference getting canceled. Nothing that happened last night is normal. That we could all agree on, whether pro-vax, and whatever aisle you sit on when it comes to this fence, that we can all agree on, right? So for me personally, I don't want to hog the mic, but I'm just glad that Elon's created a platform where we can all talk about all possibilities without getting shut down.
And that
So
was
Nelson,
one of the things I mentioned to you last night, was the fact that we could all come and talk about this on your space. We were all comfortable on doing it, and I think it was a fantastic conversation. I do think Grant had a lot of opinions on this too, so that'd be kind of cool to hear as well.
Look, I hit these guys. I saw it going off while we were in this room talking about college, whether college education was worth going to or not. And I saw this news, and then one of the other hosts, Jonathan Bing, hit me in the background and said, "Hey," he was getting ready to go off on it. "Hey, there's a news alert." And I said, "No, hold up," because it would have destroyed the room. I mean, because we had this other thing going on. And so we all got kind of behind the scenes and said, hey, should we cover this? It's going off right now. It's live. It's kind of, to some people, it's going to look predatory that you're jumping on this message. But of course, all the studio, all the TV channels are all covering the story, right? So we shifted the topic. I think at that time, most people thought because of the way the NFL had responded, the guy had died. I mean, I've been watching football for 54 years. I've never seen him stop a game ever for anything. I've never.
And we had some doctors in the room that believe the same. I'm sorry.
No, all good. Yeah, sorry. Continue, Grant.
I've never seen a game stop for anything. I've seen people hurt. I've seen people freaking look like hit so hard and removed from the game. And I've seen players quit in the middle of the game, like OB did. Or AB did, and so I've never seen a game stop, man. And I'm like, okay. Jonathan Bing, one of the other hosts, said, okay, he had to die. That's the only reason they think he's dead, for them to stop that game. Now that we know he's not dead, you're looking at two players. NFL, New York had to be called to be involved. This was over 1 hour and 15 minutes from the time of the hit to the time that they finally said, game over, we're not going to do this again. A lot of people are involved at the NFL level. You guys got to believe that they're thinking with this new data being a lot of players. I think there's a 400% increase in players that have been dropped because of soccer in 2021 over the previous 3 years. And all the young boys that have had these sudden deaths on field. And the NFL, mandated and forced and was publicly forcing players to get vaccinated. So the issue was, okay, if I bring up the vaccine thing right now, am I going to be like, oh, he's just playing a card and and this is the anti-vaxxers, which I'm not, by the way, an anti-vaxxer. I just don't want the vaccine in my own body or my kids' bodies. Whatever you want to do with your body's fine. But, had we not had all this messed, botched rollout, forced mandates, threatened job, military people. I mean, the best people in our country, first responders, nurses, firemen, policemen, military, threatened with their jobs and their pensions if they didn't get vaccinated. All the households in America that have been arguing about this, husbands and wives, moms and dads, that literally, there's divorces over this goddamn vaccine. And for people not to ask that question now, hey, is this more of that? I think it's a fair question, personally. Probably a third of the people that follow me on Twitter thought it was wrong and I shouldn't have done it. It's insensitive. And I'm like, okay, whatever. Everybody's got an opinion, but not everybody has the vaccine. So I'm sorry for the family. Everybody, I'm glad this kid woke up this morning. If he's even stable, I don't even know if we're getting the real data. Does anybody know the update?
Nick, you there? You got to unmute, man.
And regardless, Mario, the world's still going to ask this question, regardless of what we're told about what happened to him. They can say it's a cardiac arrest. They can say, but those that are suspect are more suspect now.
See, this is the worrying part, is regardless of the outcome, even if the investigation comes out and they say, well, this was because of these other causes that are not vaccine related.
Yeah, that's right.
And people are going to be skeptical. And I think that's what is the reason for the police presence, is because regardless if there is God forbid a death, which I hope that there is not, people are going to attribute it because they lost trust in the system. And that is the problem with the silencing that has been going on, is because people have lost trust in the system. And once you lose that trust, it's hard to get it back. Yeah, go ahead.
I'd like to, Catherine, I'd like to suggest that the trust it's not like we did something wrong. I didn't lose something, right? They lost. They were treasonous in the way we've been given data. You need a mask, you don't need a mask. 6 feet or 60 feet. Like,
Well,
this
I will push back ever so slightly because I agree with you. I do think there was a massive error in how this was done, and some of it is negligence. There's a lot of elements. I think some of it was also probably changing data and not understanding how some of this works at certain points. Some of it was certainly political. So I think some of it is not necessarily malicious. Some of it is also trying to figure out how to deal with something on the scale that and human error as well. So I think we need to give a little bit of room for that as well.
So for Brampton,
but if we're changing data, if science is actually collecting, changing data, and then changing with the data, why muffle my message? Why
I agree with that. I don't think that
cancel my ideas or opinions.
And a lot of it was nonsense.
Why can't I ask
the
questions?
5 feet rule, right? We know this now because they admitted it. The 5 feet rule was completely made up. It was made up to make us feel good, to feel as if we had a sense of security. Doing hours. Like when they were locking people up, they were saying, "Oh, you can only enter the store at 5 to 8 p.m." Like the curfews. What was the point of that?
Arbitraries everywhere, Ian.
Yep.
6 feet, the mask, which mask, over your nose. And the arbitrary has now moved into the kids being vaccinated.
That's right.
America is still the most pro-vaccine country on planet Earth. While other people are lifting restrictions, we're still pressing them. They're still pressing for children to be vaccinated. And the people are hostile about this. This is the hottest topic in America today. You force me to do something without having all the data. You threaten me with my job. Hang on a second, please. Okay. You threaten me with my job. And by the way, anyone that had an opinion was fucking canceled, except for this platform. If we did not have this platform right now, we could not say this.
That's right. You're banned on YouTube for talking about this. Literally, if you were to put this space up on YouTube, even with our discussions, even pro-vaccine people in here, it'd still get banned because you can't talk about it. You're not allowed to. Same thing on Facebook, same thing on TikTok, same thing on Instagram.
That's right. You
nuts.
Can't mention COVID on Instagram right now. You have to bleep it out. Otherwise, that video will be taken down.
Catherine?
I think some of this also comes down to attitudes that the different governments had towards their populations, right? So if you were, I think, in some places, it's about trust for your population. So in terms of like what rules were, the rules about the 5 feet or the masks and what information was given and not given, it's like, how much do we trust the population with information?
I want to go quickly to Nick. Grant mentioned, Nick was asking about the latest updates. So before we go to Anish, Joanna, Dr. Danish, and Katie, I'd love you to give the audience an update because you're there at the hospital, still there for some weird reason because you're a bit crazy by the looks of it.
Mario, he's different, bro. He is different.
Come on, Nelson.
But we appreciate you, brother. Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you, sir. So basically, the latest update that we've gotten here is that Hamlin he's still intubated. He has still been sedated, or he's still sedated, not responsive. There has not been a lot of updates that we've received from last night. As I said earlier in the show, a lot of you guys weren't here, so I will sort of reiterate this a little bit. I'm sorry, there's an ambulance in the background. I'm literally at a hospital. They did mention the fact that he did, in fact, go into cardiac arrest again last night after being revived after 9 seconds of CPR on the field. So he was revived on the field. And then they brought him to the hospital. They were going to have a press conference at UC Medical Center here, and they had to call that off because he ended up going back into cardiac arrest. So currently at the moment, that's where we're at, and that's what we know. We do expect another press conference to be happening here within the next hour. That's what I was just told. So just stand by for that. We'll hopefully.
I've got a question for the doctor. We'll get more clarity. That. So, you mentioned that he had entered cardiac arrest a second time. Is that normal for
no?
This.
No, that's exactly why I brought up early as soon as I heard that from Nick, I actually interrupted. I'm sorry, I didn't raise my hand. I was like, oh my God, because that really clues you in. So this whole question about is it commotio or not, right? This is not the normal thing that happens after commotio. It's also, you have commotio, you have VF, you are resuscitated, you get defibrillated, and because it was just that cardiac injury that set off this thing, right? You don't expect. I mean, folks, technically speaking, somebody who has commotio with, again, commotion is a diagnosis of occlusion, meaning you have nothing structural going on underneath. You have nothing electrical going on that's wrong. These folks can go back and play sports again because it's such an incredibly rare lightning strike event. So the fact that this happened, I mean, that's a key thing that I don't know that anyone knew. I found out on this space is that the fact that he had that happen again, that he went into cardiac arrest again, if that's verified, if that's confirmed.
Yeah, I was going to say, Nick, is that 100% verified before we continue?
That was what when I was here last night, and the aunt of Mr. Hamlin was coming out and giving updates to the crowd that was gathering. That is what she had said. So that is.
Can I add?
That is I can verify that was
that strongly suggests, because that would then explain why he's still intubated, right? Because the question is, well, why is he still intubated if he had one event? I mean, that would explain that. Okay, his heart is currently active. There may be electrical arrhythmias going on. They may be planning to take him for an ablation, specialized procedures to try to get rid of whatever electrical activity happening. There's a lot of work going on right now that requires him to stay intubated in order to kind of keep everything calm, so you can quickly figure out what you have to do for him, because it doesn't make a huge amount of sense unless he suffered some head injury, and it wasn't.
So, Dr. Coca, I just want to push back a little bit on what you're saying. If he's intubated, sedated in the ICU, and critically ill, we see a lot of patients who are critically ill who do undergo cardiac arrest.
No,
right?
But
Would you disagree with that?
Dr. Gu, I mean, I again, from a wealth of experience in the CCU for a decade, I mean, again, these are out-of-hospital cardiac arrests. Yeah, by the way, they come in, right? If their initial result is gone, it is very rare for them to have recurrent effect, especially if it's commotio. So it's not that, yes, of course, patients that are critically 85-year-old patients with pneumonia who have sepsis, yes, of course, those folks do have a propensity to have cardiac arrest. Why a 24-year-old, otherwise healthy person has commotio, is defibrillated, comes to the hospital? It is not typical for that person to then have cardiac arrest again. All right. I mean, it not that it's impossible, but it's unlikely. So it would explain a lot of things that are happening right now in terms of why it is. I mean, if it's only 9 seconds of CPR, we know he didn't have a significant head injury because he was able to actually get up and do something for 5 seconds before he fell down again, before he syncopized and lost consciousness. That tells you it's a primary cardiac arrhythmic event. And
that's what it appears as, but we don't know.
We don't know that.
We don't know.
Well, I mean, it strongly suggests that. I mean, if he had go through the differential, if he had an MI, right, you'd be hearing about an angioplasty. If he had an aortic dissection, he'd be there. I mean, they'd be operating on him, right? So the likely thing is it's something. It's something arrhythmic. The question is, what is underlying that could be causing that? The fact that he had another episode, okay, that tells you that he may have something happened with his heart that something is going on within his heart that is kind of creating these kind of recurrent things, and that's a very, very important clue, and that may be why he's still intubated and all that. I'll say, by the way,
can we verify that it was actually 9 seconds versus 9 minutes? Because that actually really makes a huge difference in prognosis and things like that. So the things that I've read, and of course I'm not there, was that this was a 9 minute episode, not a 9 second episode.
That it was 9 minutes. I misspoke on that. I'm sorry.
Oh, 9 minutes?
Yeah. So I want to take a step back again, because this is what Grant and Catherine were talking about now becomes even more relevant. And Anish, I appreciate you weighing in and thinking it's a primary cardiac thing. We just don't know. And I think what we've learned from what Grant and Catherine were saying is the biggest mistake has occurred in terms of the inability for we are, everybody's got their camps, and they're saying, and Eugene kind of alluded to it, which is, well, people are saying it's because of the vaccine, so we had to have something to say. No, we don't have. We're doctors. We're healthcare professionals. We actually don't have to come up with a counter narrative that may or may not be true, because unlike the random person on Twitter that's posting that this could be related to the vaccine, they actually don't have to worry about people then questioning whether doctors are just fighting with narratives instead of with evidence. And I think that is the standard that should be left for doctors. So I appreciate you, Eugene. I know you know that I believe what you do is great. But at the end of the day, we have to be even more careful to say we actually have no clue what's going on yet. Unless any of you are actively involved in the care of this patient, We have to be very, very careful about that because
Doctor,
we
I
don't
have a
know.
question. I have a question for you, just briefly. What are your thoughts with Grant and Nelson's concerns about how this unfolded? Is very unusual. Now, I've never experienced anything like this. I can't comment on it. Would love your thoughts as well as other panelists.
On which aspect? The way the NFL is approaching
No,
this?
the way it was all communicated, the way the press conference was cancelled, how the game
If the
was
guy
cancelled.
had a cardiac arrest at the time of the press conference, I'm assuming they should move the press conference. I mean, that's what I'm hearing from Nick right now, and so I think that is completely normal. That in that situation, those doctors should be involved in the care of that patient, right? And so ultimately, there must have been, just like right now, you're seeing on stage clinicians talking about a patient, that a much more detailed conversations are occurring behind closed doors with that family, with amongst the clinical team, and it is an actual team of people that are trying to decipher changing information in real time. And I think that's the thing. We don't know what is going on. It's okay to say we don't know.
Katie, you wanted to jump in and disagree with what Dr. Danish was saying, I think.
Thank you. I've been listening to what you guys are saying, and I am not a medical professional, and I'm by no means an athlete. However, I used to run a 5K a day, and I did my National Academy of Sports Medicine degrees and things like this, and I was a personal trainer, yada yada yada. I very unfortunately have been experiencing. I just want to talk from like just a regular human being, general public standpoint here. And I'm thankful that you invited me in on this space because, it's not a question of who's right or who's wrong. It's just an incredibly frightening situation of which I myself have personal experience, where I was rushed to the ER with a suspected heart attack. I'd never had issues with my heart whatsoever. I turned 37 this month. This was a year ago. I had 2 vaccines, which were AstraZeneca. So like I think it was the Johnson & Johnson one. They had diagnosed me. The team at the ER in the UK were just phenomenal, and they said that I have tachycardia, myocarditis, and I had to undergo further testing, and then I had to put me on beta blockers. And then actually not long ago, I had another episode where my chest kind of caved in randomly, not caved in as in like physically, but my heart rate plummeted down to 40 BPMs when I was incredibly active, and it just stopped me on my feet. My cardiologist, who is incredibly reputable, finds it difficult to outrightly say the vaccine did this because of the fear of what it could potentially lead to in terms of, I'm not anti-vax at all. I'm just anti people putting something out there that they shouldn't do unless it's absolutely 100% verified and tried and tested.
And Katie, did your doctor kind of imply it was a vaccine, or what makes you concerned that there is a vaccine?
Because he implied that it was a side effect of the vaccine that I had. I mean, it's in my medical notes. It says we have been discussing whether it's a side effect of the vaccine. We're doing further testing. I'm not ruling it out. So, and now I had to wear a Holter monitor and a blood pressure monitor again for 48 hours. And I go actually tomorrow for my results of it. But, oh, sorry, 1 second. I have a little one here.
I'll let you. I'll let you finish it off, Katie, just to jump to Nelson as well to respond to what Dr. Danish was saying. But go ahead.
I understand very much so that okay, baby, mommy's just doing one thing, so I'll do it real quick for you, Bubba. Look, it was a very, very scary time in which, I wouldn't, me personally, again, I'm not anti-vax at all. I would not let my son have this vaccine. And I'm kicking myself that in a time where I felt very stressed and kind of, I had to be a superhero as a single parent and wasn't sure what on earth to do. I did it, and that's fine. But I put my trust and faith as a member of the general public into whomever's hands. This is before it even reaches the political and governmental discussions of it. And I am not by any means, disregarding the frontline people. I'm all for the NHF and emergency workers, etc. Even the researchers now that are brave enough to come out and discuss this so boldly and say, well, actually, let's take another look at this. That's not my issue. My issue is that pharmaceutical companies, whether they wanted to stop a pandemic and save the world, or whatever their intentions are, they have a responsibility under their job title and role to ensure that it is safe and effective. These things don't just happen. As there is a doctor here, a Dr. Anish Koka, I hope I said your name right. Absolutely. I cannot wrap my head around the fact that a 24-year-old suffered a cardiac arrest too. And I mean, obviously we're very different, but like as somebody that was fit and healthy, that I'm experiencing my own issues, which have been alluded by my own very reputable cardiologist, that as a result of a vaccine, I'm very frightened as to what's really going on inside my body, whether I had an underlying medical condition that I knew about or not. Everybody under their job title and role and responsibility has a responsibility, a duty of care to the general public to follow through with that.
I'll go, Katie. So first, I just want to, thank you for coming in and sharing the experience. And I think you've made a few points. Before going to Nelson to respond to Dr. Danish, Joanna and Lisa, sorry. What are your thoughts about Katie's concerns? Like she's not anti-vax, but she does have concerns, and she talked about her own experience. Would love your thoughts on the matter.
I think that it is fine to have concern. I think that the vaccine itself, is associated. We've seen through the data, with myocarditis. However, we cannot assume myocarditis for this particular gentleman. We cannot assume anything. We have no information. All we know is that he experienced a blunt force trauma.
Would you put it as a possibility worth discussing?
I think, again, going back to that idea of a created differential, is it something that may interfere with electrical conduction? I believe yes, and thank goodness we have cardiologists on this panel. But to my understanding, myocarditis can do that. But we need to use a little bit of common sense here too. And these are huge players facing on-field trauma sometimes and serious injury, which comes with the game. And it's terrible that that's the case. But immediately following a blunt force trauma, he had this event. Now, may there be myocarditis belying this? Is it possible? Yes. Is it likely? I don't know. But I
Joanna,
hesitate.
I want to add a question as you continue explaining. I want to add a question to what you're saying, and then we go to Lisa and then Nelson. Grant and Nelson's concern, which Dr. Danish responded about how this was all dealt with, from the lack of communication to how the game was cancelled, to I think government. I think Nick, you can comment on the government having. I think you tweeted about it. I'll let you explain it in a bit, but would love your thoughts on that, Joanna.
Repeat the idea.
So Nelson, maybe you can communicate that idea again, so Joanna and Lisa can respond to it about how this all unfolded.
I think
Yeah.
in the absence of information, I think people hesitate. Is what I understand. So I see this as being very active, without anything to announce in a critically ill, unstable patient, which Mr. Hamlin is. I don't think that they would make announcements, and I think that game cancellations, conference cancellations are a reflection, perhaps, of the instability of this situation to begin with.
Nelson?
I agree with that.
Appreciate you, Mario.
Yeah, and then we'll go right after. We'll go to Lisa. Sorry, go ahead, Nelson.
Joanna or Dr. Danish, or any of the doctors on stage, I have one question first. Intubation and life support, are those the same thing?
So when a patient is intubated, they first are bag mask ventilated, and then they are put onto a ventilator to support their respirations. So life support, in the way that you're perhaps conceiving of it, thinking of a patient on a ventilator, he is receiving life support. He is receiving supportive measures to assist with his breathing at this time if he's still intubated. And that may be appropriate given the fact that he may have hypoxic related brain injury if he was not intubated in the field. We don't know that. I presume that during the arrest event, he was bag mask ventilated. He may have been intubated, but oftentimes following an arrest, what they will do is actually cool patients down to decrease the oxygen demand in the body and perhaps alleviate some of the stress and strain that comes with that hypoxic event. But I hope that answers your question.
It does, 100%. And because I didn't know this before, right? But here's where I'm coming from with this, right? I mean, we've seen multiple cases of, families who have been advised to take, their loved ones off of life support, but decide not to do so, right? Hoping some magical event happens. Would you say that there is a possibility that he's being kept on life support? I don't know, either the government trying to, whatever the case may be, right? Would you say that is remotely even possible in this situation, given the fact that we don't know everything?
I think that, to me, as an intensivist, as an ICU physician, because a patient is on a ventilator or intubated, does not necessarily mean that they are not going to be able to do well. He may have a full recovery. That is possible, if they did high quality CPR and were able to oxygenate and ventilate during this period of time. So being on life support, which he is, being on a ventilator, and he may have other devices supporting him right now, is not necessarily a prognostic of his necessary outcome.
Lisa? Dr. Dunn?
Yeah. So Katie, I'm so sorry to hear about your situation, because it is really scary for people who have, that have unexpected cardiac events. And it makes you nervous. And once again, I think that lots and lots of people are focusing on cardiac events now because they're in the news. It's important, once again, to understand that there is a differential diagnosis behind this. And just as a statistic, there's an article in Resuscitation from the American College of Cardiologists, and this was looking at data in out-of-hospital cardiac arrests in younger people, pediatrics, so anywhere, infants all the way up to 17-year-olds. And this data is from 2016, so it precedes COVID. And the data was gathered from a database where EMS, so paramedics, enter this into a database, and then it was evaluated and published in 2020. And there are over 23,000 annual pediatric out of hospital cardiac arrests in the United States every year. So these are numbers that predate COVID, and that suggest that there are multiple other causes, and these are tragic. These people are not aware of this data because the focus is not on it so much. It was not on it so much until this discussion around COVID.
So Lisa, go ahead, doctor.
I just wanted to.
Oh, go ahead, Sandy.
Yeah, I'm a cardiologist in New York. There are so many possibilities here, but really the most overwhelming possibility, given what I've read, is that this is a case of commotio cordis, which is fibrillation of a normal heart after a particularly ill-timed trauma to the chest, causing a cardiac contusion and causing fibrillation. This has been described since the early 1900s. As the previous speaker just pointed out, scores of young athletes drop from cardiac arrest every year. because of a hockey puck or a baseball to the chest. There's no reason to invoke COVID or myocarditis here. Absolutely not. As a cardiologist, I can tell you that we see this not infrequently. And, the alternative scenario is that he had an underlying cardiac condition like hypertrophic cardiomyopathy or something, which is, an abnormal thickening of the heart that presumably would have been picked up in testing. But there's no reason to invoke COVID, myocarditis, the vaccine. This sort of thing happens very, very frequently every single year.
I agree, Sandeep. Did you think if there was a recurrent cardiac arrest in the ICU as is being reported, that does make it that's not typically what one sees with post out of hospital cardiac arrests, or you wouldn't expect to see that with Commotion. So that's why it makes me wonder about other possibilities. But you're right. We have to stay open. And I think anyone who prematurely goes to either vaccine myocarditis or COVID myocarditis or any it is very premature and it is not correct. Well, I mean, it looks certainly from the video evidence we have that it's something arrhythmic, and that's about all we can say. And the fact that what happened since then, meaning he's not in the OR getting repair of an aortic dissection, he's not having a stent or having an angioplasty or whatnot. I mean, those are the only other clues we have. But again, the recurrent nature of that cardiac, I think that's a very important clue. But yeah, I mean, eventually, the people who are going to provide the most clarity on this are going to be his treating team of physicians.
So moving away from Damar, just as a general point, I would like opinions on that. Carolina, I know you've got concerns about what the doctors were saying, so I'll give you the mic right after Lisa. But Lisa, I've got a question for you. Have you looked at the statistics? Is there statistics? And I think Dr. Peter McCullough tweeted something, I think earlier today, not long ago, about a paper by Dr. Polly Credis and myself regarding the sharp rise in athlete deaths into PubMed and how it increased since vaccinations in recent years. But I'm seeing reports on both sides of the fence that statistics show that more people are having, are dying from unknown reasons, and people are linking it to vaccines, and others are showing reports that no, statistically, there's no big change. Have you looked into the statistics? Has anyone done so?
Well, a couple of things really quickly, just to point to, I'll get to the statistics question after one comment about Anish Koka's comment. It is not, in my experience, unusual in ICU settings and in cardiac arrest settings in the emergency department either, to see repeated cardiac arrest when you've got somebody with a brain injury or other injuries as well. A repeat cardiac arrest doesn't automatically raise, an arrhythmogenic focus as higher in the differential. Once again, we have no idea what happened here.
Also, once a cardiac arrest occurs, there's injury that can be a focus for an arrhythmia.
Yes,
so it
that's
doesn't mean
exactly right.
the person had a pre-existing propensity to fibrillation.
Yeah.
But the vast majority, again, the vast majority of Commotion is one time, which is why you actually, they get cleared to play again.
Yep, I agree. And so once again, we'll need further testing, or we'll need to know about further testing to see what the etiology of this was. But in terms of the statistics, the paper that you just mentioned, Mario, no, I haven't seen it, so I can't comment on it. There are lots of people who are saying that there is an increased risk of sudden cardiac death, and making the claim that it's associated with the administration of vaccination. I think that there are multiple reasons why if indeed that is true, and I'd have to look at that statistic more closely and to be able to comment reasonably. But there are multiple things that also could contribute to that. If you are not seeking medical care for 2 years, there are lots of missed diagnoses that could have been intervened upon that may have that weren't. So you get delay of diagnosis in things like cancer, in things like cardiac disease that might have been treatable. But since in 2020 and nobody was going to the doctor, you've got that delay.
I've got look. Sorry, couldn't finish your point, and I've just got a general question before going to Nelson and Tom.
Sure. And then not to mention the fact that COVID itself had a really big impact on increasing deaths. Now, maybe a lot of people have had COVID itself and have not been diagnosed with COVID. But it's so widely prevalent that it is feasible to believe that people who have gotten COVID themselves are more prone to some of these diseases because of the inflammatory nature of the disease, and we know that it does cause cardiac damage. So even in people with COVID, I expect that's part of the whole increase as well. So I hope that answers your question, Mario.
Yeah, I want to go. So by the way, Dr. Drew and Dr. Khalid, I've sent you both an invite. If it doesn't work, just DM me and we can fix it. I know Dr. Khalid, you're trying to come up. And Dr. Drew, you might be just listening in, but always a pleasure to have you. Question for all the panelists. Is there, and I've got this question, a lot of people in the audience are asking that question. Anyone that wants to ask further questions, bottom right corner, you can ask the questions there. But is there an increase in reports in worldwide excess deaths? Because I'm seeing a lot of reports about this. I haven't verified it. I'm not sure if anyone would like to speak on this point. If anyone's looked at the data, is that true or is that misinformation, or we just don't know?
Well, no, there is excess mortality. This is a very broad question. There is excess mortality in a variety of different countries that's seen. But the problem is, how do you figure out what that excess mortality is from? Which is why I raised to Steve Kirsch when he was on a panel earlier. It's like, well, okay, so Sweden would be your best bet because Sweden locked down the least. Because how do you know if it's lockdown effects, COVID effects, or vaccine effects, or whatever effect you want to say? But okay, so Sweden, if you look at 20 to 40-year-olds, unless you do some complicated statistics, there isn't an excess mortality signal in 20 to 40-year-olds. So they're pretty highly vaxxed. So I mean, somebody has to explain Sweden to me. If yes, there's an excess mortality signal, but to attribute it to the vaccine, I don't understand why
excess.
Sweden
And is that Dr. Coca? Is that excess relative to what? What other year?
Yeah. So excess mortality, it's a nice little thing because it's an internal control, right? So you basically would look at Sweden and you'd say, all right, what is the mortality relative to the prior year? So you use the country's last 5 years average mortality to say, okay, is there an excess in deaths that are seen by these age bands? And so that's how you kind of do it. And so again, in young people, 20 to 40-year-olds, I haven't seen a less than 20 analysis, but the question really is Sweden. Why is Sweden not showing an excess mortality signal if it's vaccine related? So,
yeah, Britain did a study recently and they found, well, they decided that the excess mortality there is caused by the lockdowns. Essentially, a lot of people who could have gotten treated for very treatable illnesses like cancer were not given the proper support. They didn't get to see their doctors. They didn't get diagnosed early enough because, the doctors were all not serving them, right? It was lockdowns. And that's the reason why a lot of older people and a lot of poorer people who couldn't see private doctors actually succumbed to their otherwise treatable illnesses. It wasn't really caused by, vaccine or anything like that. It was more to do with lockdowns.
This goes back to the point that I always make: causation versus correlation. Things could happen at the same time and not be related, or they could be related. And there's many examples of this. So it's something to always keep in mind. If something correlates, it doesn't mean causation exists. But I'd go to Nelson, then Tom. Nelson.
Appreciate you, Mario. I mean, first of all, thank you to all the doctors, coming on these spaces and, giving us all this information. But here's the thing, right? This is information that we're all being sold and told, right? None of us are in that emergency room to know what's really going on. None of us are in there. We're being given this information. We're being told this information. How do we know if anything that we're being told is true? I mean, all of us are familiar with damage control when it comes to large corporations, governments, etc., passing on information to the media in order to prevent outrage, right? All of us are very familiar with that concept. I mean, that happened throughout the pandemic, right? A lot of that we wouldn't have found out if not for the Twitter files. I mean, U.S. government plates outside the hospital where an NFL player who dropped suddenly on the field was taken to? That makes no sense. And guess what? We heard that from Nick, who was and still is on site. CNN didn't report that. Fox News didn't report that. We heard that from Nick. Why are U.S. government placed outside this hospital?
Nick, did you want to respond to this? We'll get to that, Lisa, in a sec. Lisa, I'll get to that question in a second. Nick, go ahead. You want to respond to Nelson and respond to Lisa's question about whether he's been vaccinated?
Sure. Well, I would imagine just based on the fact that the NFL literally forced their players to get vaccinated, or the penalty was lose millions and millions of dollars by not playing the game. So I would imagine, yes, he was vaccinated. That's speculation. We don't know that for sure. We don't have those medical records, but that's a pretty safe assumption there, I would say. When it comes to the U.S. government vehicles, there were 4 outposts that were around the Cincinnati metropolitan area. There were 2 in Kentucky, and then 2 on the north side of Cincinnati. The reason being had to do with the fact that the large crowd that was gathering outside of the hospital last night. That was one of the largest reasons, because they didn't know exactly what was going to happen, right? That's one of the things that I was bringing up a little bit earlier in the space is where's the breaking point? That's where that's where the feds are they're a little bit worried about that right now, because there is a lot of skepticism. And where is the line? At what point do people, really get mad and really start pushing back on this stuff? And that part added into it a lot, as well as the fact that Joe Biden is actually coming into town tomorrow, and they were worried about the possible.
And is that, sorry, Nick, about Joe Biden, is that public information or just from your discussions? Because I did include it in the thread when you mentioned it to me earlier, but never asked you about the source and whether this is public.
Sure. Yes, this is public information.
It's on his campaign thing. It's on his website. Yeah, it's on his schedule.
Correct. Yes. So it is public information. However, I did confirm with the Cincinnati police that the presence last night, although they did have more federal agents in the area due to the fact that Joe Biden is coming tomorrow, the federal presence yesterday with all those agents did have to do with the fact that they weren't sure exactly what was going to happen with Mr. Hamlin in the hospital here.
Khalid, good to have you, Doctor. You wrote a thread that I'll read to the audience. I read it earlier as well. My prayers are with Damar Hamlin. As an arrhythmia specialist, I believe the blow to his chest during a certain period in the cardiac cycle triggered ventricular fibrillation, a condition called CC, commotio cordis. We've talked a lot about it, and you kind of made that tweet, even though we don't know what the cause is, and it's too early. We're just speculating. You made that tweet just because of the amount of people assuming or speculating that it's the vaccine. Would love your thoughts on it. Would love on the there's actually 2 points I want to ask you about. The fact that the resuscitation took 9 minutes. Is that correct, Nick? Not 9 seconds, as you mentioned earlier.
No, it was 9 minutes. I'm sorry, I corrected.
9 minutes, yeah. So
I don't know if anybody heard that.
And yeah, yeah, correct. And there was a second cardiac arrest at the hospital. Can you please confirm that again, Nick, just before Khalid speaks?
That is correct. As of that, we did not get that information from a doctor. That was from the aunt of Mr. Hamlin. So that is straight from her walking out the door late last night and telling us that. So that's where that came from.
Dr. Al-Jabri.
Yes. So thanks for having me. So, I mean, just to start, I think Nelson had some, very valid questions. But, the diagnosis of commotio cordis is basically made upon clinical scenario. And, let's look at the facts in front of us just by observation. There was a witnessed blunt chest impact. That's number one. That was followed by an instant collapse. That's number two. And usually we need available EKG data demonstrating ventricular fibrillation. Now, I didn't see that. We don't have it, but we have a surrogate because the reports tell us that he needed to be shocked. And you only get shocked if you have a shockable rhythm, and that's ventricular fibrillation or ventricular tachycardia. So for me, that makes it the most likely diagnosis because it was in front of our eyes. The only thing that would take it to a certain diagnosis is basically the absence of structural heart disease in imaging studies that are probably being done right now at the hospital. And that's why, regardless, even if I was convinced 100% that CC was a diagnosis, I would still run a battery of tests to exclude every other thing. and that can be structural heart disease like ARVD or HCM, hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, or arrhythmogenic ventricular dysplasia that we see with athletes. But in professional sports, usually athletes are aggressively screened against these structural diseases. Now, the fact that, the resuscitation took 9 minutes, I'd like to know how much of that was CPR and when was the first shock delivered? Because in reality, CPR only buys you time. What you need to restart a heart after a ventricular fibrillation arrest is to shock the heart and restart it, a defibrillation. And sometimes we don't get that with the first shock. Sometimes we need to increase the energy of the joules basically to restart the heart. There's also one other important point. And, with 9 minutes of resuscitation, that means hyperperfusion to organs, including the heart itself. And that can result into injury to the myocardial muscle. And, if I were to guess, probably with the undergoing investigation that Hamlin is that being done to Damar at the moment, probably you will see some evidence of myocardial dysfunction that is a result of a primary commotio cordis event. Is there a possibility that he had some subclinical pathology going on that made him, that wasn't even necessarily the cause, but made him more vulnerable to the impact? It's quite possible, but I would put that very low in my differential diagnosis list. And by the way, there's not a lot of literature that describes how these two entities interplay, meaning secondary myocardial dysfunction to a primary commotio cordis event, or basically a pre-existing vulnerability that makes you more predisposed to having it. The people that have more of the data, the people that my prayers are with, are his medical team right now. And I'm sure even if they're convinced that CC was the diagnosis, they're doing tons of tests to exclude other causes. The fact that he did not require any surgical intervention, as you alluded to earlier, effectively excludes things like aortic dissection or any kind of coronary artery disease.
Do we know that he didn't?
Go ahead, Nick.
Did we know that he didn't require any surgical intervention?
I'm only looking at the tweet from the team's official today, and they said he's being evaluated and treated. He's sedated and he's in critical condition. My guess, if there was at least a procedure, they would have at least said, without elaborating more, they would have said, and he's undergoing some kind of procedure. But yeah, and by the way, like there's another term, since we're talking medical terms, contusio cordis is another term that differentiates commotio from contusio. Is basically when you have a more kind of robust impact to the chest that results in myocardial rupture or even like an aortic dissection. That is usually very lethal, instant, and would require surgical intervention right away.
So I've got a question that's being asked by the audience, and any panelist could take that question. Sam, good to have you on the panel. Feel free to jump in or put your hand up anytime. Could the government be trying to keep facts private, confidential, to avoid panic? So could it be induced by the vaccine, but they do not want the public to know? Nelson's clapping, so I'm guessing that question was asked in his space as well, and he shares that concern. Would love your thoughts on it. Anish, I see you unmuting.
I think that's, I don't know why one would jump to that. I can't imagine I can't imagine the government is efficient enough, honestly, to be able to suddenly create this blanket of things where you're not allowing things to come out. So I understand where it comes from, and there's a lot of fear about it, but about there being some cover up. But I just knowing how hospital systems work and health systems, how the heck will that happen for somebody to get to the cardiologist and the treating team to, I heard earlier that this question about, is he being maintained on life support because, is there some conspiracy about doing that? I think that's incredibly, incredibly unlikely, just knowing how, I'm sure all the doctors on the panel agree, knowing how hospitals work and whatnot. But Dr. Khalil was saying, again, I think it's not, I don't know how anyone can, and then the reason that the team at Cincinnati is going to do a cardiac MRI, is going to keep him on tele for probably a good while, is going to do a number of other tests, maybe even serology for a variety of different things, is because you cannot prematurely say that this is just commotio. Yes, you had it. But again, even within the commotio cordis literature, which by the way is very small, and so nobody's an expert on it, you can see that football collisions is actually one of the rare things within that. So look, it's certainly possible. I wouldn't. I mean, I would definitely. He definitely needs a more extensive workup, which I'm sure the Cincy folks are definitely doing.
Nick and Tom, Tom, good to have you again. Did you want to respond? I saw you trying to speak, Nick. Do you want to respond to what Anish was saying, Nick?
Yeah,
and
yeah.
Then Tom?
I just want to respond real quick, Dr. Coca. When it comes to trusting the government and the government's not efficient enough, I agree with that part. The government isn't efficient at all. So we'll go there, and we'll agree on that. But where I disagree is the fact that we already know, we already have proof that the government was lying to us in the beginning of COVID when it came to masks, especially the efficacy of vaccines and what vaccines actually did. You had Dr. Fauci on TV telling us that you shouldn't be wearing a mask because it doesn't do anything for this disease. You also had him on TV saying that this vaccine prevents you from getting COVID. If you get this vaccine, you will not get COVID. That's why people don't trust the quote unquote science here. That's why we've gotten to a point where we don't even know who to trust anymore.
Tom, with
Yeah,
all,
this has been a great discussion, Mario, and I'm concerned, obviously, about this young man's life, and all of us are concerned about it. And we're hearing the discussion about the withholding of information about the vaccine safety and efficacy, which has undermined confidence and has raised some of the questions we're talking about here today. But my view is when we're faced with all these issues, what's the way forward? And that's why I tweeted out almost immediately, first of all, highlighting that the vaccine was pushed on players by the NFL. And so it wasn't necessarily required, but certainly you were on the wrong end of things if you didn't take it. And so I want to know when, and so given everything we know, my view is as an activist and, someone trying to get things done, what next? What do we do in light of the circumstances? And I want to know, when is the league going to investigate whether the rare myocarditis vaccine side effects are impacting players, including making them more susceptible to game-related severe heart injuries. So the question is, to me, is myocarditis, whether induced by vaccination or by COVID itself, is it weakening the heart in a way that may not be readily apparent to doctors examining someone, that makes one more susceptible to traumatic heart injury like we saw on the field yesterday? You could have the blunt force trauma that could have been shrugged off in other circumstances affect this player because of a prior vaccine or COVID myocarditis risk. Unless that risk is better adjudicated or investigated, if I were a player, I'd sit out next Saturday, or in the least, make sure that the equipment has been increased to protect that area of the body that could cause a heart injury. And is the players' union going to step up? And I'm sorry, we don't wait for the full diagnosis and the investigation of this young man's situation before we get answers to those questions, because to me, there's a level of urgency here.
Tom, wouldn't?
And there's a lot of people's lives on the line. We've seen previously, because of the failure of public health authorities and other people in positions of responsibility to say, okay, we've got to do something else here to reassure the public.
Tom, wouldn't you expect more cardiac arrests given that all these football players have received the vaccine? The fact that this is a extremely rare event that's consistent with historical data with young athletes really points to a more benign interpretation. And to really use this young man's tragedy as a reason to spin a conspiracy theory about the government, to me, I think is just despicable.
Who said that? Who said there's a conspiracy theory?
That's what I'm hearing.
I mean, I asked a series of questions that almost are that really don't necessarily require an analysis of this person's injury. And to say that those questions are despicable and talk about a government conspiracy theory, you got to get another set of talking points. And we need to move beyond that. We know that myocarditis is an increased is an increased issue for men in that age range, and they're highly vaccinated in the pro athlete community, and we need to protect their health. And I'm not going to be cowed by name calling and ad hominem attacks.
Yeah, the problem. I think the part of the problem is going to be. Sorry, part of the problem is going to be how the investigation. Some of the investigation will hinge on a cardiac MRI, and the cardiac MRI showing evidence of whether or not it shows evidence of scar. Right. That's partly why you're doing a cardiac MRI. That's one of the important pieces of information. Now that can be a very subtle finding. What we're looking for is something called late gadolinium enhancement. And if it's super obvious, great, it's super obvious and it's hard to miss. But I'm telling you, there's a lot of gray area, and what I'm really hoping is that there isn't a lot of pressure that the treating team feels, and they just need to make their decision, kind of without all this pressure or whatnot. But and the one additional thing I'll say is that one of the huge problems with doing cardiac MRIs as a screening thing, which is what Tom is kind of. I know he didn't say cardiac MRI, but Tom's question was, what can we do from a screening standpoint? Doing cardiac MRIs is a huge issue. Because that was one of the major problems with COVID myocarditis and how that diagnosis was kind of made a little too easily based on basically a German group did a bunch of cardiac MRIs on a bunch of folks who had maybe recovered from COVID, saw some bright spots light up, and was like, oh look, that's COVID myocarditis. If you did a cardiac MRI right now on 100 athletes, I'm sure some percentage of them will have some bright spots show up. And the question is like, why the heck what does that mean? And we're not going to know what it means. And it would be inappropriate for somebody to say, oh, this represents this or that. So that's why cardiac MRI should really only be done in patients who have some type of clinical suspicion. And it's a
I'll
tough,
go.
it's a
Yeah,
tough,
and
tough
I'll
question.
go. I see everyone has their hand up. So before going to Joanna, then Dr. Danish, Nelson, I think you're going to echo what Tom was saying, and then we'll get Dr. Danish and Joanna to reply, and Dr. Aiken.
100%, Mario. I have to. I definitely agree with Tom. The day and age of calling everything a conspiracy theory, it quite frankly is gone, especially because of what Elon did with the Twitter files, right? And at the same time, Dr. Sandeep, I completely get, where you're coming from. But at the same time, you have other doctors. Dr. Ryan Cole was on our stage yesterday. He would have disagreed with what you just said right now, 100%. And this is an individual that probably has, more or less the same accolades that you do, but on the other side of the coin when it comes to these topics. So, it's very important, Mario, and I appreciate you, brother, you and your team, what you guys do here, creating these spaces and giving a chance for both sides to have a discussion. I think it's very important because it raises awareness with every single individual that walks into these spaces. And that's what we need to be doing. So again, thank you to Elon for making this happen. And to Dr. Sandeep for the last time, brother, the day and age of classifying everything as a conspiracy theory is over.
Nelson, I'm not saying that what Tom was spinning was necessarily a conspiracy theory. What I'm trying to say is that it's definitely worthwhile to ask about the government's COVID policy and their policy on vaccines, and to look at the decisions that were made 2 years ago with regard to COVID policy and social mitigation and whatnot. But to use this instance, this case, as speculative fodder that the government is trying to suppress information to protect its vaccine policy, there's just absolutely no evidence for that. It's purely speculation, and it's going to lead to misinformation. So I think we should step back and look at more likely scenarios before we start going there. That's my point.
Well, the fact is, I don't know what the government's doing it in this case. The fact is, the government is withholding information and refusing to voluntarily disclose information about the safety and efficacy of the vaccines in violation of federal law. How do I know that? Because we're litigating about it. We've been litigating it for 2 years. And it's not atypical of the government's approach to issues like this. So I would highlight that lack of transparency and the withholding of material information about the safety and efficacy of the vaccines, or information I would consider to be material, at least. I guess we can argue over that point. undermines confidence in the handling of this case. So whose fault is that? If the government wants us to be confident in the vaccines, they would treat it as vaccines ordinarily are treated, and they would be transparent about the testing regime and the safety and efficacy, as opposed to, as Nelson was pointing out, using and abusing their powers to suppress legitimate questions about it. And when someone drops on the field like we saw last night, and we're immediately told it's too soon or that we can't ask questions about it, given everything we know about the vaccine, that vaccines increase the risk of myocarditis in that age group, that doesn't persuade anyone. It just suggests to folks that, suppression is continuing.
Joanna, I know you've been trying to speak, and then Dr. Danish, and then Joanna.
Question about what do we
I don't
do
think he can hear me.
I think it'll be helpful, perhaps. The easiest thing to think about for the next 24 to 48 hours is, I think we'll at least have a clear sense of what was the inciting incident. We may not have a clear understanding in the next 48 hours or so of exactly what underlying abnormalities may have exacerbated this, but we'll know, for example, did he have myocarditis? I'm pretty sure there'll be some incidents of there will have some data to be able to say yes or no. I would be surprised if taking a vaccine changed something structurally about his heart. That would be highly unusual and actually just like not even, something that we'd be worried about in terms of long-term structural changes. So I think that ultimately we'll have a pretty good understanding. I'm sorry.
Yeah,
Anish,
you want
but to that point, I do not. I think it's inappropriate to link this gentleman's thing to vaccine myocarditis at all. Right, but it is, of course, one of the big concerns about sudden cardiac arrest, even before the pandemic, was that there was some considerable rate of subclinical myocarditis that may cause this thing. So we do know that vaccines cause myocarditis, and it is certainly one of the big issues with myocarditis long term. And this is by Oster, the CDC, Oster and colleagues. There's obviously even they. It's just well known that myocarditis was more around. If you have myocarditis and scar, then long term you can have some prognostic issues. Exactly. I don't know if that. But we have zero idea whether that applies here. And so, but one of the points, and I'm sorry, I'm going to shut up after this for a while. But one of the points I wanted to make is that LGE, which is the late gadolinium enhancement that's seen on cardiac MRIs, that is not a black or white thing. Okay, so if he's got a significant burden of scar on a cardiac MRI, then okay, that's going to be relatively obvious that there was something structurally going on here that made him predisposed to having this. But if he doesn't, if it's a sometimes these things are it's a gray area, and so I just hope that there's not a lot of pressure put on.
But there's an opportunity to rule out some of these things. I wanted to address Tom's specific question on what will we actually know. We may, again, Anish, thank you for clarifying, but we may have additional data that will rule out some of these issues, and we may not, and that becomes a gray area, and we'll continue this discussion. But I think a lot of information will come to light, and I think jumping ahead, asking questions, I will disagree with Sandeep in this. Asking questions is completely fair, to Anish's point, actually. But ultimately, we'll have more answers in the next 48 hours that I think will give us. I think jumping ahead is probably a bad idea. That's all I was trying to say.
I'll go to Joanna. Joanna, you've been waiting for a while, so I'll let you jump in.
Thank you. Yeah. So I'm hearing two separate conversations happening here, and I just want to take a step back again. Regarding Mr. Hamlin, this is one scenario, this is one case, and I hesitate to delve into the COVID vaccine specifically. Is it possible we've gone through the potential in a differential? And it may be worth talking about, certainly, but to assign a hypothetical myocarditis, I would pump the brakes. Again, common things being common, and looking at this video and knowing that he experienced a blunt force trauma immediately preceding going down. We need to consider these things before getting into the weeds, and we should get into the weeds regarding COVID. I don't disagree with that, but I think that there is a time and a place for those discussions, and I hesitate to politicize these issues.
Joanna, I've got a question for you, Joanna. So Robert Malone tweeted, "This is a case of overdiagnosis. It is just as bad to jump to conclusions that this was due to cosmocyocarditis, as to jump to conclusions about vax injury." The tweet continues. So he's saying both. Would you? I'm not going to ask you whether they're both equally plausible, but would you say that they're both plausible and they're both worth discussing? And then the next question I have for you is: do you have concern? Do you share the concerns of Tom and Nelson, and I'm sure others in the audience that are commenting? Do you share the concerns that the facts could be kept out of the public knowledge for various reasons?
I think that first we must stratify what is most likely and what is less likely. And again, talking about these things in an open and honest way is certainly something we should be doing, but considering first that this patient may or may not have had myocarditis, we don't know, and then to make the next assumption that that may have been related to the arrest event, which it may not have been, if he had myocarditis to begin with. I think that we're making several jumps here, and we've got to stay centered and first recognize our own limitations in the situation. I don't think that it's wise to immediately jump to any particular diagnosis. I think that it is perhaps more conservative and more appropriate to observe what has occurred and to create a likely a differential, again, of what most likely happened. And that may include exacerbating factors, which we can discuss, but again,
Joanna,
I hesitate.
One last question before I go to Tom and Khalid. Do you, and that question kind of goes to all the panelists, I actually want to ask you and Sandeep, do you have concerns about vaccine induced myocarditis? Is that a concern you have, or is that something you don't even think about?
So
I'll go to Joanna and then Sandeep, and then we'll give the mic to Tom and Khalid, and then I want to go to Sam Ghali, who's been on the panel for a while, and I'd love to get his thoughts on all this. Go ahead, Joanna.
I think as physicians, we owe due diligence to deciphering what happened here, and it may be that the answer is very obvious, and the physicians who are caring for Mr. Hamlin at University of Cincinnati Medical Center know exactly what the inciting culprit behind his arrest was. In the absence of that, we have to turn to those less likely etiologies, and certainly, I think that exhausting that list may be necessary in the absence of a clear source. So yes, I think that I would give it credence. I would consider that if I was on that team. Would it be something that I would consider? Perhaps. Would it be lower on my differential? Absolutely, it would.
I want to get Sandeep's thoughts on this before going to Tom and Khalid.
Thanks. Yeah. I mean, every bit of evidence I've looked at in journals, referee journals like the New England Journal, Circulation, the Journal of the American College of Cardiology, tells me in a nutshell that the myocarditis and myocardial injury from COVID infections is much, much higher and poses much higher risk than the inflammation in a very small subset of patients who receive the COVID vaccine. So I have encouraged my patients to get vaccinated, even those with heart disease. Yes, I do think it's worth asking whether certain populations, for certain segments of the population, should be vaccinated. But the vast majority of adults will do better with the vaccine than getting.
So I'm inviting doctors again because try to keeping the panel balanced. So you're inviting doctors that have more concerns with the vaccines, just to kind of give that different side of the different opinion. But Anisha, I'll let you comment quickly on this before going to Tom and Khalid.
Sandeep, do you think? Curious, do you think that NFL players, young NFL, healthy NFL players, do you think that was a demographic that should have been kind of forced to be vaccinated?
I think that it's reasonable to ask whether professional athletes required vaccination. I think there were many considerations, health as well as financial considerations. So I can't tell you for sure, but I can tell you that a young person who gets COVID is much more likely to develop an arrhythmia and die from myocarditis than after getting vaccinated.
I'm not sure that the data is that clear on that. I've looked at, for instance, the ACC document that said that. The ACC document that says that, and I looked at every reference on it, is pretty poorly supported. I'll send you the Substack on it, but I'll just say that it's not so clear to me that it's definitely much higher. I mean, a young, healthy young man who is definitely higher risk of cardiac morbidity and mortality from COVID versus the vaccine. So, but thanks.
Tom?
My concern is that the politics are actually on the other side of this, that the failure to investigate and fully examine the impact of myocarditis on these affected populations is political. And asking the question is not political. Refusing to pursue the question is the political outcome. And so again, is there enough information out there, for instance, to put a moratorium on providing vaccines to younger people until they figure out this myocarditis risk, both the long and short and long-term risk, and what is its nature? Is there enough information out there to suggest that anyone who receives the vaccine of a certain age, especially these athletes, should take it easy? And should there be screening to make sure there's no myocarditis damage to the heart? And maybe do a longer term study to make sure that there's maybe there's clinical there's subclinical evidence that doesn't show up till later. I don't know.
I think it's worth pointing
this
out
is this is the sort of questions we need to be asking. And is there enough, for instance, for someone who has COVID, as we heard earlier, to take a break from the sort of activity that could cause a significant heart failure or heart condition?
So I think
I
it's
don't
worth
know.
pointing out that
But we're not allowed to ask these questions, because to ask those questions calls into doubt the government policy to push this vaccine on populations despite risks that had never previously been tolerated for other vaccines and medications.
Okay, so I'd like to add to that, if y'all can hear me. The Canadian government just paid out $2.8 million in damages caused by vaccine injury. It is basically 1 in 10,000 people experience a severe reaction to the vaccine, to the mRNA vaccine.
But how does that compare, Sandeep? I see you on mute, so I'd love your take on that.
I just thought I'd mention that.
Yeah, Sandeep, I'd love your comment on this. Then I want to go to actually, Khalid, before you go, I want to go to Molly. I just invited her back to get her thoughts on this, and then Khalid, you can reply to Molly if that's okay. But Sandeep, do you want to reply to what Ian just mentioned?
These are complicated questions, okay? And they're certainly worth discussing. But my consistent point in this conversation has been that using this young man's tragedy as the basis for speculating on what the government is doing to protect its COVID policy, that really makes no sense. It makes no sense to invoke COVID vaccines or COVID myocarditis to explain this particular young man's tragedy. So that's been my consistent point. The questions you're asking really require a separate conversation. But the point about this young man is the one that I'm trying to make, that it just bothers me that when the explanation for his cardiac arrest is just so much more likely to be something that is consistent with what we've seen historically, that I just don't understand the reason for pivoting to COVID policies, and vaccine issues?
I think Sandy, before going to Molly, I want to go to the point that you just made. I think the concerns with vaccine-induced myocarditis is why, and according to Nick when he spoke to various reporters, is why this is getting so much attention. And that's quite why I'm kind of, because we can only speculate so much about Damar's condition and what led to where he is today. But I want to kind of use this as an opportunity to discuss the concerns that people have, and we're doing a lot of spaces on this matter, the concerns that people have regarding potential side effects of the vaccine. So I want to go to Molly. Molly, I'd love you to give us your thoughts on what was just discussed, and also a message to people that did take the vaccine. Should they be concerned, and why, and what does the data show according to you? And then we'll go to Khalid.
Hi, thanks. I just want to say, if this case of Mr. Hamlin is handled appropriately, we may not know, we may not get the answers. I think the bigger picture.
What do you mean by this, Molly?
Well, I think, if his family, if he recovers and he wants to reveal what happened, if his family wants to reveal what happened, we should, our personal medical information should be protected, okay? But I think the big picture with this conversation is that many people, including myself, have been censored over the past couple of years for even raising these issues, raising these concerns. Actual medical doctors who are seeing side effects from these vaccines, whether it be the severity of side effect like myocarditis, or whether it be something less severe but still debilitating. And so I think it's healthy for us to have these conversations. And I think it's normal for people to wonder and be worried, because many people, despite the fact that they did not want this vaccine, got it. I have friends who got this vaccine. I have a friend who was mandated because he works for the federal government to get it. He had already recovered from COVID. He did not want it. He's 1.5 years from retirement, and he was basically told he would be fired if he did not get it. That's a problem. That's not under normal medical ethics. That is not appropriate. So I think that's why this conversation is more important than determining exactly what happened in this one case. We may not know that. We may never find that out.
Molly or Dr. Rutherford, one other question before going to Dr. Al-Jabri. So you share the concern that Nelson and Grant Cardone mentioned earlier, and I was looking at the comments from the audience, and they share that concern, is that the information could be censored, or at least the truth regarding Mr. Hamlin could be censored, or did I misunderstand?
I don't know that it'll be censored. It may not be our business to begin with, because it's his personal medical history.
Understood. Yeah.
Yeah. Now don't get me wrong. I think there is a coordinated effort. I don't know who's leading it, but there is a coordinated effort to make it so that we cannot talk about these vaccine side effects that we are seeing. I was censored from Twitter for months because of raising these concerns. I was censored from Twitter for telling my own personal COVID story, which was that I really didn't have very many symptoms and I took hydroxychloroquine. Just that one word, hydroxychloroquine, I got a misinformation tag on my own personal story. So to me, I'm glad that we're able to have these conversations now, and I'm hoping that we can heal and come together as a nation and investigate what is happening. There's no doubt in my mind that young man probably, if he did get vaccinated, I don't know that he did, that he probably didn't need it, and he probably would have done fine with COVID. Is it possible that he just had some underlying congenital heart defect? Absolutely. I think it would be great to have those answers, but I just want to prepare. We may never get those answers.
Khalid and Eugene, I'd love your thoughts on what Molly just mentioned.
Quick comment. What happened yesterday was tragic. It's scary for everybody, including physicians who've seen multiple cases like this, sudden cardiac arrest. And I think there's a lot of concern going on. I think there's a lot of energy, in asking a lot of questions, and that's fair. And I agree with Molly. There are some questions that we might not know the answers to, and that's why I think equally we should direct our energy to the questions that we can answer, and they're going to be easier to answer. So, for instance, like, is there something the NFL can do other than revising its COVID vaccine mandate and making a choice to players? Is there a way to prevent such recurrence of a high impact blow to the chest that might result in another cardiac arrest? I'm not an NFL expert, but these things can be including, coaching techniques, rules against the same kind of collision that led to that incident yesterday, protective equipment. Although the current data is not very favorable, but they might be something that can be protective. And also, like, we know it's an established fact that if people get defibrillated right away, you're going to have a positive outcome. There's a reason that the initial registry on commotio cardio and all the registries, on cardiac arrest, the survival rates are getting better and better. There's a reason we have more survivors, and it's because of CPR and availabilities of AEDs. And there is no reason to stop saving more lives. So, equally important about asking, was this related to COVID vaccine? Is it a red herring? Is it, an association doesn't imply causation? But also there are questions that we should ask ourselves. What can NFL do to render the sport safer? What can we do to make CPR training universal? What can we do to make AEDs easily and readily available for anyone who suffers a cardiac arrest, whether on the streets, in a gym, in a mall, in an airport? And that's, I think, we need to save some energy for that.
Khalid, I want to ask you one last question.
Dr. Khalil, it seems like, it's such a rare event. If it is truly, some rare event, do you think that there needs to be a wholesale, other than, of course, having an AED around so you can use it right away? And I hope to goodness that it isn't a 9-minute time period between, arrest to CPR. Other than that education and training piece that's needed, I'm not entirely sure what one can do prophylactically other than not play high contact sports. And especially because the Barry Marin paper in the New England Journal of Medicine showed that that these protective pads, they're certainly not perfect or 100% have an ability to protect this from happening.
Absolutely. And Barry Marin and Marty Marin actually taught me when I was a fellow. So we spent a lot of days discussing these topics in clinic. But what I'm trying to say is, while, like, if we talk per se about what happened yesterday and we look at the clinical scenario, we can say that, what is a likely diagnosis and what is not a likely diagnosis. But what I've seen also is the tragic event yesterday being also becoming an opportunity to discuss things that are not specifically related to the exact event yesterday. And this is why it should also be an opportunity.
I understand. Can I ask you a question? I understand. I understand your point that you feel that, there's the discussion is going beyond what the case itself may support. I understand. As an electrophysiologist, would you, and seeing the collision that happens, it's a collision that's very, very common, happens all the time in NFL. I mean, way harder collisions happen, actual helmet into the chest. This was a, helmet into the chest collisions that happen all the time. Would you, if the entire workup was negative here, and, it becomes more clear that, okay, it must have been commotio, would you feel comfortable clearing a player like this to go back and play?
I would go to the consensus statements of the ACC and AHA, and I think the last one in 2015 basically said that competitive athletes can return to training and playing games if the workup is quote unquote entirely unrevealing. So it has to be a tailored decision. It has to be, in a specific by specific case. I have to be fully comfortable that there is no scar on an MRI, that even if he has, transient left ventricular dysfunction that is resolved, I need to rule out everything else like Brugada syndromes and all the electrical channels abnormalities. And once I'm comfortable, I will, probably, follow the recommendation by the ACC and AHA. Understanding that there are some very few cases in the literature where people who were, everything else was excluded and it was a confirmed diagnosis of commotio cordis, they came back to the ER with wide complex tachycardia. So like a slow ventricular tachycardia, something that makes you ill and dizzy, but it doesn't kill you. And, I think at least in the couple of cases, an implantable defibrillator, which basically is a device that we implant as electrophysiologists that surveils the heart and delivers a shock if needed, was recommended. And I think both cases declined. And by the way, I know it's not the same scenario as what happened yesterday, but at least in soccer, we see now recently more and more players going back to playing games despite suffering cardiac arrest. I think Christian Eriksen, with Manchester United and Denmark, played recently, with an ICD. There's Daley Blind in the, Netherlands team also has an ICD that fired some, for normal tachycardia at some point. So the literature is scarce. But like, just to answer your point shortly, if all the workup yields no other, cause or, something that predisposed Damar to what happened yesterday, then I would probably feel comfortable telling him you can go back gradually to sports.
I want to quickly go, if you don't mind, Eugene and Nelson. I want to go back to the point, because Nelson, I know that many people were very vocal about this yesterday, regarding the concerns on whether the information will be shared with the public and whether there's more to it. Now, we had some call it a conspiracy theory. Others say, no, censorship is real. And we've seen this recently with the Twitter files. So, Eugene, I'd love you to comment on the points that were just made, but also on that concern by Nelson, Grant, and others from yesterday's space, because it's a point that I want to touch on again, because the audience is really asking a lot about it in the comments.
Yeah, definitely. Before I address that, I do want to take a few steps back from our armchair discussions of a commotio cordis versus myocarditis or HOCM and all these other discussions, and bring us back to why are we all here in this space discussing this. And I think it's because millions of people, myself included, were watching TV, and we saw this really heartbreaking event where Damar just inexplicably collapsed, fell down. We didn't know if he died there on the spot, if he was critically injured. It was a heartbreaking thing for millions of people and a traumatic event for millions of Americans. And so my question is actually for many of the physicians here too, is when something like that happens, what are our ethics about how we participate in a discussion where we don't have all the information? I don't know exactly what happened with him. I'm not the physician taking care of Mr. Hamlin. I'm not in the ICU. I have no information about what his EKG looks like. I don't know if he even got a cardiac MRI, right? There's so much lacking information that myself and many of you here around the table also are in that information black hole. What is our responsibility and our ethics when it comes to participating in such a discussion when we don't have that information? So that's number one. And then to address a point, I believe.
No, I'll let before going to the second point. I think it's a fair question. I think Grant mentioned that he received criticism when he covered the story. And Nelson, is Nelson there? He just dropped out, but I'm sure Nelson would echo that. And I've had the same feedback. There were some people that did say, us even discussing this is just insensitive. I think it's just the way my personal thoughts before I go to Tom and anyone else that wants to comment on that point. My personal thoughts is just the way you discuss it. Like, we're not talking about, we're using Damar's example and discussing the facts that we know. We're trying to keep, we're trying not to make it too personal, but also including it into a broader topic about the concerns people have with vaccines and also there's a hashtag died suddenly that the team was telling me about. So I think it's a topic worth discussing. And, the reason that Damar's case is getting so much attention, as Nick mentioned earlier, is because of the potential vaccine-induced myocarditis playing a role. But Tom, would love your thoughts on this point.
I think it's because they actually ended the game, if you don't mind me saying that really quick, Mario. And they don't usually do that in the NFL. They don't usually cancel games, especially this late in the season, playoff games that are this crucial. I think that's a big part of why it's getting so much attention, to be honest, is that they actually ended the game. The NFL called it, said no more, they're not playing anymore. I think that, had they continued the game, this probably would have gotten a lot less attention, in my opinion.
Yeah, it's never been done before in history, right? This is unprecedented. Usually, if a person is even grievously injured, they just pause the game for a while and then they continue. But this time, they decided
even if it's near death, like we know some people.
Yeah.
He
Even if it's
away.
near death, like before it has happened, where a person
They
has
can
like a
do.
massive concussion or something like that, or breaks a bone, like they won't stop the game completely. They pause it for a while. Everybody waits around for like an hour and then they resume, right? But not this Like I've never seen this happen before.
I think it was the right decision personally, but I just wanted to say that that's what I probably put even more of a spotlight on. This is the beginning of the game, and the entire game was called off. So
Yeah, I mean, you have to understand
Tom?
the logistics of stopping the game, right? This is not just, people watching it on television. This is, networks, advertisers, bettors, sports bettors, like everybody's impacted by this. A lot of money exchanges hands. We're talking potentially billions of dollars, right, for a single game. So, yeah, it's a big deal.
So I think we should, Ian, I think we should applaud them for making the right decision.
Oh,
and,
absolutely. Like, no question.
And
Yeah, no
employing
question.
some sensitivity.
Yep.
The fact that they made a decision that was unusual doesn't mean that they're trying to hide something.
no, if anything, it put more of a spotlight on it. I would say the opposite happened.
Well, it was a national news event, just his collapse, and the questions flow naturally from it. And to suggest that certain questions are wrong to ask and others are correct to ask is, I don't think, the way to go, especially since the family or the patient may decline to share any information about his health. So, to me, there remains the urgency, which hasn't been addressed either by the NFL or our public health officials seriously, about the risk and the effect of vaccine-induced myocarditis, and whether that impacts the ability of players to play or puts them at risk. And let's stop pretending it's not an issue and do a serious analysis and investigation of it. And this player and what happened to him, however terrible it is, may or may not provide support for that argument. But he could have, his medical issue may be completely separate and apart from the vaccines, myocarditis, or even the blunt force injury that were being offered here as a possible risk. But it still doesn't answer the question: is these young men are at increased risk for myocarditis related to vaccines, and does that put them at risk if they play for a period, too soon, either after getting the vaccine or for whatever period of time? I want to know the answer to that. It's a reasonable question dictated by the studies that are popping up, admitted now by the government there is a risk of myocarditis for these young people.
Jump in, Freemason. Go ahead, man.
Hey guys, how are you? Freemason Brendan Green here. I just want to point out a couple things. I went to high school with a kid named Taron Abernathy. Same exact thing. He died on a field. Incredible kid. Was going to go to NCAA Division I football. And a lot of times, what happens with athletes, and I don't want to say it's not the vaccine. None of us know. That's number one. I'm a lifelong Buffalo Bill fan, by the way. Having said that, in this kid Taron's case, basically his heart wall was enlarged from being an athlete. In fact, the overwhelming amount of deaths that do come in sports, most of the time is from an overgrown heart due to hypertrophy. And I'm sure the doctors on here that have some privy to that would back that up. The other thing, too, what Ian was saying, this is unprecedented. Of course, there's been injuries. We've seen quarterbacks' legs broken in 3 spots. The center from the Jets back in like '94. But this is like an absolute had to be done and put to rest until another day. Unfortunately, this game does dictate who takes the top seed. But having said all that, I think none of us know. And some of the frustration that comes out is, of course, people jump to conclusions immediately. That's not to say, of course, that it's not vaccine related. I mean, do we even know if the man had the vaccine or boosters? I know that there was mandates by many of the sports leagues, but I'll harken back. Thank you, guys.
So one of the questions that I do have for especially the doctors on the panel, after everything that we've discussed today, how do you believe that we can have the general population regain trust in our health officials, in our especially in the United States, the CDC, and Dr. Fauci has become a villain to.
Before we go there, Nick, Before we go there and change topics, can I
think
just
that
really
we really
quickly
need to
ask?
improve our
I don't think
I
Liza
think she
can hear me.
can. Yeah, Liza, just
I just
quickly,
really
Tara.
quickly wanted to. I
Oh,
just really
sorry, I didn't
quickly
hear.
wanted to
I'm
ask
having
if you
trouble
guys.
hearing, so I can't tell if
Oh, good.
somebody's
Oh,
on.
good. Yeah, Liza. It's just a glitch that happens a lot. So, all
Yeah,
good.
it's
Yeah, sorry.
okay,
Go
no
ahead,
big deal.
Tara, and
But
I'll give
really
the mic to
quickly,
Lisa.
just if you guys covered the other football ex-Jaguar player who also passed away yesterday, not who passed away yesterday due to a heart attack or heart failure at 38 years old. Did you guys talk about Uche Wanari, or was that not brought up here?
No, we haven't covered it. Ian, Nick, have you guys looked into
No,
this?
I've not
story?
really looked into it. I know he was 38 years old, that he died, but I have no idea how he died or what he died
Yeah,
from.
did he die during the game?
No. He died at
He
home.
wasn't
Died at home.
playing a game. He was at his wife's home in Indiana and died in the night. So, but he was very pro vaccines, and even had made a tweet saying that vaccines should be mandated. Anyone who refuses should be jailed. Pretty, I don't know, extreme. So I was just curious if any of the doctors here had looked at him as well. I know that the other, situation has gotten a lot of eyes on it, but it seems that, this one has kind of just gone by quietly, but he did pass away, unfortunately.
Yeah, sure.
So rest
Yeah,
in
if you
peace.
could send me through the article, Tara, I just had to read through it now and just share it with the audience and if and how it relates. So thanks a lot for sharing. And Lisa, can you still hear me? Lisa,
No, she
Dr. Dunn?
dropped. She dropped. I think it's.
Oh, she
if
dropped. I
it's-
think just because of the glitch.
Yep.
Yeah. So while bringing up Dr. Dunn, would love your thoughts, Anish, Sandeep, Joanna, and Khalid, and of course Eugene, on Nick's question, because actually it's a very good question, and I've tweeted that same question. I was surprised, and I wasn't too deep into this topic on social media, but I was surprised about the amount of criticism and hate that Dr. Fauci is getting. And I was curious. So I made a tweet asking that question, and the amount of engagement it got was insane. It just shows how passionate people are about this topic. Would love thoughts on this. Like, first, why, and second, how do we regain public trust after the what happened in the past couple of years? Yeah, just jump in, Joanna.
Yeah, I think that to an extent it has to do with the ability to discuss uncomfortable matters in an honest way with one another without fear of retribution. And within the medical community, I think around COVID, doctors fundamentally, we want to help people. That's really what we want to do. When things become politicized, as they truly did with COVID, I mean, it happened around, an election, if you recall. I fear that conflation may cause distrust. And I think that we need to separate these things out again. We cannot have, and to the best of our ability, science and medicine functioning alongside or integrated with politics to the extent that they are currently twisted together. It's a matter of separating these things out and going back to basics. That's my belief.
Yeah, and,
Yeah,
and
I just want to
before,
agree with
before I go to Eugene, just want to tell the audience, because we do have, I just announced now that there's 2 Twitter files dropped today. So Ian was just telling me we're going to get a bit of a rest before covering those in a bit. So me, Ian, and Tara will cover those as soon as they drop. So I just wanted to let the audience know, keep an eye out for the space to kick off as soon as Matt Taibbi drops the next Twitter file. For that point, just make sure you follow all the panelists, including the ones that were on the panel earlier, before we kind of wrap up the space. But Eugene, would love your thoughts on Nick's question.
Yeah, definitely. I just want to agree with what Joanna said. I think even we as physicians can tend to bully each other, especially if we disagree with others, and especially when it's on social media. I've experienced that myself. I think many of the physicians here may be able to agree with me on that. We can be a vicious bunch. And in order to regain trust for physicians and the healthcare community, I think it's all about having more free and fair discussions where both sides are here, can discuss things with one another without ad hominem attacks, without like
Thank you,
labeling each
Eugene.
other anti-vaxxer,
Like for real,
or
thank you.
all
Like
kinds
it's
of
it's really good
attacks.
to hear you say that. I mean, like I think you have me blocked on Twitter, and I have launched ad hominem attacks on you, and I've had the same thing done to me, not by you, but by other people. So no, it's actually good that we have had this discussion here, because if anything, Elon has provided us with a space where we can actually come together and talk about these issues without demonizing each other. And it's a lot harder to treat someone like shit when you're speaking to them versus you're texting them, right?
Right, I appreciate that, Ian.
Yeah, likewise. Thank you.
Tom, Anish?
Yeah, I mean, it would strike me some of the basics are full and immediate transparency, a change in approach by the government public health officials who think they run government as opposed to advising our elected leaders and the populace, a recognition that these discussions aren't, quote, medical discussions. They obviously include medical analysis, but the decision to take irreversible medical treatments, major policies that shut down schools and workplaces and restrict freedoms and liberties, those aren't medical decisions. In the end, those are public policy decisions that relate to self-governance that can't be made solely to the exclusion of other experts and voices by medical professionals. And so the kind of the acknowledgement of that, and then bluntly, those who committed misconduct need to be held accountable. The one way to build trust is to put the bad guys in jail, or to make sure there's accountability for the misconduct in other ways. And until that's done, and an acknowledgement that there was misconduct, then when you have, for instance, Dr. Birx, proudly talk about how she subverted our Republican form of government by ignoring the directives of those who were elected, and saying she was proud of it, and she gets kudos from the media about it. Boy, unless folks like that are held accountable, it's going to be hard to think that any of those public officials who replace her are in a position of trust, because we now know there's that temptation to do what they want without regard for the public interest or the will of the people as expressed in presidential and congressional elections. There's no reason to trust these folks unless there's significant structural reform, which, as I said, includes transparency and accountability.
Anish? Dr. Koka?
Yeah.
Sandeep, jump in.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to say that, I'm not going to talk about putting Dr. Fauci in jail, or I think that would,
I didn't say to put Dr. Fauci in jail.
Right. No,
he wasn't referring. Yeah,
Tom,
he wasn't
just to
referring
be clear.
Okay.
He should be investigated. It doesn't mean he goes to jail.
Yeah. No, but I think that would set a terrible precedent to imprison a public health official. But I just wanted to make one quick point about a question that was raised about whether there's more incidents of sudden death in young athletes. I wrote an op-ed about sudden death in young athletes in the New York Times in 2016, and there was talk back then, based on articles that had been published, that the prevalence of sudden death in young athletes was increasing. And this was data that had come out of the University of Washington. And I spoke to quite a few experts, including Barry Marin. And the overall consensus was that this was not a thing. This was more an increased awareness of the problem. So I would put it out there that this is something that people were talking about pre-COVID, and it's unlikely that we're seeing an increased prevalence. It's just more of an increased awareness, given social media and all the speculation about possible causes. So I don't see that being an issue. I've gotten several direct messages from folks pointing out an increased risk of sudden death in college athletes post-COVID. This is a discussion that's been going on for a number of years, and the databases are collecting data in a better and more complete fashion, and I think that lends the sort of sense that this is an increasing problem. It doesn't seem to be. So that I just wanted to put that out there. Thank you.
Dr. Coca, and thank you, Sandy. I think it's your first time on the panel, so appreciate being
Can
here.
I just want to make
please.
one point,
Go ahead,
is
Dr.
that,
Coca.
which I'm reminded by a colleague on here, actually, Ramin, who's another cardiologist, that all of this is fair. No one is. I think it's premature to link the vaccines to what happened here yesterday. That I'm going to reiterate that for the 10th time. But look, there is a reason. Again, we're just putting it out there. The Singapore Ministry of Health, right? In July of 2021, after a young man playing, I think he was playing soccer, he was doing some athletic activity, he had a cardiac arrest, a significant event, and some severe morbidity after that. He did survive, I believe. The Singapore Health Ministry at the time said, okay, out of an abundance of caution, we're going to recommend no exercise after getting a vaccine for a week. All right. So I think we should all be, as cardiologists, I get it. We want to, we want to hew to our guidelines, etc. But we just need to be humble about what's happening and what we're doing here. And certainly, discussing this openly, which has not been something that has happened since April of 2021, which is when we first started seeing the signal of, say, myocarditis. So, for instance, if we had just talked about the fact that yes, vaccine myocarditis happens, that should be part of the informed consent. If we had a more open discussion in that way, even though right now it is very hard, as I've said before, the Sweden data is what it is. There isn't this excess mortality signal in 2040s. It may be that vaccine myocarditis does not ultimately result in some signal of death that's significant, right? But we should at least have that open conversation about it. And certainly the CDC director, as of December of 2021, saying, well, we've looked at this and we don't see a signal of myocarditis, when there's clearly a signal seen from April of 2021 on. That does not do a lot to engender trust in the public. So a lot of the issues we're having now that Sandeep speaks to very well, in terms of trust and skepticism, and is driven by the fact that there has not been an open discussion. And so I'll agree with Ian and Mario and stuff, and that these kind of discussions are important. And if we do want to kind of restore trust in the institutions in public health.
And Dr. Dunn wants to come up and give her final words. But Nick, you've been on the ground, spent hours, didn't sleep at night, covering the story. You're the one that woke me up to do the space earlier, and we decided not to do it. And yeah, man, I don't think you've slept yet. So first, hats off to you, man. And would love your final thoughts on the matter. I think we did a great freaking job with the panel. So very grateful for you and the team in having it balanced and having a really good discussion. And covering not only the Damar story, but the concerns that people have with vaccines. And I think we all conclude that it's a very valid concern. We cannot conclude on what the reason is for Mr. Hamlin's cardiac arrest, but vaccine-induced myocarditis is a discussion worth having. I think everyone on the panel right now agrees. I think we did a good job in covering it. Would love your final thoughts, Nick.
Sure. It's clear that there's a lot of support from all around the country, all around the world, actually, for Damar Hamlin here. Last night we saw hundreds and hundreds of Bengals fans, as well as Buffalo Bills fans that were here. We're seeing, I just pinned a tweet up at the top where there are people have come and they've hung up signs, they've hung up flags, they've come and they've spoken to reporters. One of the biggest takeaways was somebody that said, I came here to support him. He wasn't even at the game, but he came here to support Damar from Buffalo, New York, because, quote, he is our soldier and we want him back home. So it's pretty encouraging in a world that is so dark right now to have a little bit of light to support somebody that's really struggling. So.
And finally, Dr. Drew, I managed to convince you to drop in for your thoughts on the matter. Thanks for being in the audience and listening in. Doctor, can you hear me, Dr. Drew? Ah, shit. It's playing up. Tara, while just seeing if Dr. Drew's mic would
There we
work
go.
to get his
I'm
thoughts on
back.
this. Oh, what's up, man? How are you?
Great to be here. As always, when my peers get together and discuss these things, it's a worthwhile conversation. And I continue to thank Eugene for being a solo voice many times in some of these rooms, and he's done a great job at that. But
thanks,
a question was asked that never got answered, and was a feeling about our ethics discussing this on the heels of such an awful tragedy. And I would just simply posit, ethically, we are compelled to discuss this for two reasons. As we've all pointed out, this was traumatic for the country. They were triggered into thinking all kinds of who knows what about vaccines and COVID, but mostly they were traumatized by seeing somebody in a near-death experience. It is our job to explain, give them information, what happened, not to discuss the particulars of Damar's case. That is not our business. But in cases like this, how do you understand what this is? How do you protect your family? Number one. And number two, we have an ethical obligation to educate. And when else are we going to educate other than when the world's eyes turn to a particular case? When we go to medical school, we learn by cases. That's how we teach most effectively. And here's a case, a tragedy, but we have an obligation to discuss it.
And what are your thoughts, Doctor, about the concerns that were voiced about the truth not coming out? There's that massive distrust in anything related to medical institutions and the government.
I think it was articulated by the participants with great clarity. And I think, again, it's up to us physicians to regain our profession, to regain our collegiality, to reestablish control over what medicine is so that people can once again begin trusting it. My frustration has been with what has sort of been brought up a number of times here is we are seeing signals. Some of them are really problematic in terms of populations that have almost no risk from COVID. We might be making healthy people sick, and we need to know, are we doing that or not? Just a simple question, answer it. But it feels like, and this may be completely wrong, that because there's a possibility that the vaccine or COVID plus the vaccine or COVID itself is the culprit, the question never gets asked, so it never gets answered. And that's very frustrating when we're trying to give informed, Anish mentioned this, we're trying to give informed consent. We're trying to understand what we're doing for our younger patients. And it's really hard to do that till these questions are asked and then investigated.
And last question, because I know you just jumped in, you don't have much time to give us your final thoughts. The question I have is your concerns regarding vaccine-induced myocarditis. I know you've discussed it in the previous panel, and we discussed it at length. I would love your final thoughts on this.
It's been said in the panel. I know what I'm doing with the vaccine with my patients over the age of 65. They're all vaxxed. They're all boosted. I've seen no adverse events. I believe that I've helped that population. How far we go with this, how much more boosting, I'm a little unclear about. And what to do with a 35-year-old or a 25-year-old who really has essentially no risk from COVID. What am I doing there, and what is the risk reward, and how do I give that patient informed consent is still foggy to me.
Eugene, wrap it up with your thoughts on what Dr. Drew just mentioned, and then we'll wrap up the space.
Yeah, definitely. So I agree with a lot of things that Dr. Drew is saying. He's always, as usual, very eloquent. The one point of disagreement that we may have is whether vaccinating younger individuals, whether the benefit outweighs the risk. I believe it does, and I also believe that there are many things that we as physicians do where we put patients at risk for preventive measures. One would be, off the top of my head, a colonoscopy, right? In an older patient, doing a colonoscopy, that is not without risk. You can have a perforation, you could kill the patient with doing a colonoscopy. But as you know, from looking at the evidence and the data, doing colonoscopies especially for men, over age, 50 or 60, has benefits that outweigh the risk. You can find, an early stage colon cancer and save the patient's life, even though you place.
But Eugene,
so
I'm going to push back and just say you're making my point. There's a reason we don't do it routinely in 35-year-olds because the risk is not outweighed by the benefits. And that's my concern with the vaccine. That's all. That's my only concern. And one of us is going to be, you're going to be either absolutely right or my concerns are going to be absolutely right. But I want to get the information. I don't care who's right. I just want the information.
Appreciate it, Dr. Drew and Eugene. Everyone else, thank you so much for joining. Tara, we've got the Twitter drops in a bit. Would love your thoughts on what we're expecting today before we end this space. Again, just want to remind everyone to please follow all the panelists because they're probably going to cover this story as it progresses. And we've invited them here on the panel for a reason. So make sure you follow them all. But Tara, you want to wrap it up with what you're expecting with the Twitter files drop later today? Tara's not here. All right, guys. We've got the Twitter files later today. I'm going to end it here. Thanks a lot, everyone. Dr. Drew, thanks a lot for jumping in last minute. Anish, Eugene, Joanna, Lisa, Khalid, and all the other doctors. Thanks a lot for